Chapter 451. Of course, Chen Pingping did not believe it. Back then, the old people all knew that the chest was in Lady Ye's hands. However, when Lady Yi was killed, she had not used the chest. This meant that at the time, the chest was not in Taiping Courtyard. Afterward, Chen Pingping conducted a detailed investigation of Taiping Courtyard and did not find any trace of the chest. Such an extraordinary item naturally couldn't be casually thrown away. Then, only Wu Zhu knew the whereabouts of the chest. As Fan Xian gradually grew up and lived in such a dangerous environment as Jingdou, if Wu Zhu was not by Fan Xian's side due to his injury, he would certainly have given the chest to Fan Xian to carry at all times to avoid any possible danger. This was Chen Pingping's deduction. Furthermore, his deduction was not far from the truth. However, he was wrong on one point. Neither he nor the emperor had seen the chest with their own eyes, so they had no idea how big or small it was. Fan Xian did indeed carry the chest. However, it was impossible for the chest to hide it from everyone's eyes and ears. When Fan Xian was killed in the valley because of his own carelessness, the chest was still floating on some weak water. Meeting the old cripple's mocking gaze, Fan Xian spread his hand sincerely and said, "I really don't know what chest it is." He had to keep this secret. Even if the old man in front of him could guess something, he could not admit it. Otherwise, if the emperor knew that the chest was in his hands, as the ruler of a generation, he would certainly not allow a mysterious magic weapon that could kill experts to stay by his son's side. The emperor would open his mouth and ask for it, so Fan Xian would not admit it from the beginning. Chen Pingping shook his head and was too lazy to continue asking. He knew that the little guy had to keep some protective treasures for himself. Fan Xian smiled slightly and changed the topic. "Uncle Wu Zhu, that strange chest is one of the two things you didn't calculate for. What is the third?" Chen Pingping looked at him mockingly. "The third matter is very simple. I did not account for the fact that the carriage in the council could have helped you block for a while. Given your and the Shadow's abilities, it would not have been difficult for you to escape into the snow forest alone. Even if you were injured, you would not have ended up in such a state. You have been in the council for a long time. Of course, you know that experts and assassins do not live in the same realm. It is easy to kill an expert, but it is very difficult to kill an assassin. But other than the people in the council, not many people know that you are a 9th-level assassin. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect you to be so stupid." Chen Pingping looked slightly angry. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "You're talking about me killing my way into the snowy forest to get rid of those crossbows? Was that stupid? Even if I can escape, what about my subordinates? Don't forget, in this valley incident, I lost nearly 20 of my men. I didn't call you cold-blooded, but you called me stupid." "Cold-blooded?" Chen Pingping looked at Fan Xian with a faint smile. "Have you forgotten that the Overwatch Council needs cold-blooded people the most? Where has your usual coldness and emotionlessness gone?" Fan Xian tightened his fist slightly and said in a low voice, "Those are my people. They are only your subordinates, yet you can't bear to sacrifice them. If you have to sacrifice even more important people in the future, what will you do? Your actions this time have easily torn through your cold exterior and revealed your cowardice. This is the so-called stupidity. A strong person not only has a strong body, but their state of mind must also be strong. Emotions like cowardice will only cause you to die a tragic death." Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes. A cold light shone through. "That is not cowardice," Fan Xian retorted without hesitation. "That is something I have to do." "You can't care too much," Chen Pingping yawned. Chen Pingping yawned and said, "You don't have to do too many things. I just think that your mother-in-law will be very happy. She finally knows where your Achilles heel is." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He felt a glimmer of inauspiciousness. He immediately furrowed his brows and said, "I only care about the people I care about. No matter how many other people die in front of me, I won't bat an eyelid." "Your mother cares about everyone under heaven," Chen Pingping closed his eyes and said. "In this area, you are smarter than her and stronger than her, but it is still not enough. At most, you can only live a few more days than her." Fan Xian clapped his hands and warmly said, "There is nothing more to say about these things. In any case, it is best if everyone can live to a ripe old age." He turned the wheelchair in a beautiful circle. The front of the wheelchair tilted up and circled half a circle around Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping looked at this scene and couldn't resist laughing. Is this very fun? Very, Fan Xian said seriously. You've been in a wheelchair for so many years, yet you haven't thought about how to develop a game to get rid of boredom. This shows that you are a very boring person. You spend all day immersed in a dark and muddled world. What meaning is there in living like this? According to Fan Xian's thoughts, it would be best for Chen Pingping to stay out of the matter and spend the last few years of his life going to a relatively large mountain with the beautiful concubines around him for a honeymoon or something. It would be better than dedicating his entire life to the boring business of political scheming. However, he also knew that for Chen Pingping, scheming about these things was perhaps not just work. It was also a kind of enjoyment, a kind of art. Thus he didn't say much. After I die. Chen Pingping raised his withered hand and casually waved it in the air in the garden. This garden is yours. As for the women inside, if you want to keep them, then keep them. If you don't, then disperse. Fan Xian understood that this old man would not do anything because of the lives of these beauties. However, after spending many years together, presumably there would always be a glimmer of affection. Very naturally, he nodded his head. How are you going to deal with the Qin family's problem? Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth to ask. Although Chen Pingping had told him to think of the big picture and not reveal his weapons right now, he still needed to give something in return. Chen Pingping shook his head and said, Everyone wants you to die. The Qin family isn't particularly good, nor is it particularly bad. If you make a move now, it will ruin the overall situation for me. Bear with it for now and see how their family is destroyed in the future. This in itself is a very happy thing. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. A glimmer of helplessness appeared on his handsome face. Endure it again? In this area, you have to learn from your father, Chen Pingping said with a not quite there smile. Chen Pingping said with a faint smile, Everyone in this world has died, but I see that your father is still alive. Don't say that this is not a skill. To be able to survive is already the greatest skill. Fan Xian's brows suddenly straightened like swords. Slowly he said, After all, I am a young man. I must make my attitude clear on this matter. Otherwise, any random dog or cat will come and try to kill me. It will always be inconvenient. Chen Pingping looked at him. Fan Xian did not seem to feel the old man's cold and severe gaze. He smiled slightly and said, I'll give you face. I won't touch the Qin family. I'll help you hide it and wait for the moment of the big explosion. As for the others, I will have to kill a few to accompany my subordinates in death. The wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face deepened. He sighed and said, What do the others have to do with the attack in the valley? Didn't you say it before? That all of them want me to die? Fan Xian smiled and said, Since it is so, regardless of whether or not they have anything to do with the attack, I will kill a few first to establish my might. Presumably, the emperor will not blame me too much. Chen Pingping shook his head in disapproval. Yan Xueqi has never interfered in this matter. Why must you form a death grudge with him? Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, What about Yan Xueqi's son? Half a year ago, you only said he had a very powerful son. You didn't tell me that San Shi was also killed by him. You also didn't tell me that this little archer was in the Jingdo garrison. Chen Pingping was silent. He had not explained everything to Fan Xian on this matter. Presumably, Fan Xian had used his own power to find out. It was not good for him to say more. He only slowly said, You want revenge, but it's not convenient for you to touch the old Qin family. Are you prepared to kill indiscriminately? The old Qin family has already been pushed to the eldest princess's side by you, Fan Xian reminded bluntly. I cut my mother-in-law with a knife and let them bear some of the Qin family's anger. Is there a problem? There is no problem, Chen Pingping said in a dark voice. It is just that your way of doing things is a bit unreasonable. Fan Xian laughed mockingly and said, Meeting someone as unreasonable as you, I can't be bothered to waste my breath. Don't you know that us young people are used to being unreasonable? The winter in Jingdo was cold. Although it was not yet the coldest days of the year, snow covered the residences, jade railings, and red walls. Heavy snow fell from the sky every now and then. All of Jingdo was enveloped in a cold air. The wide red walls of the royal palace were all wet from the snow and appeared a bit black. Just like the change in color of the red palace walls, all of the civil and martial officials in court knew that the Qing emperor's mood was also somewhat gloomy and dark. The news of Fan Xian's assassination had long shaken Jingdou. Everyone gradually knew the details of the matter, and guessed that there must have been capable figures in the military involved. Each time they thought of how even the emperor's most tightly controlled military had problems, the civil and martial officials were all silent and cautious. They did not dare to say anything more. In the little court conferences that followed, other than state affairs, the most talked about was the assassination of Fan Xian. The investigation was led by the Overwatch Council. In cooperation with the Supreme Court and Bureau of Military Affairs, it had long begun. However, after drawing and comparing the 200 heads, not a single clue could be found. The survivor the Overwatch Council had caught was already on the verge of death. He was only hanging on by a thread. For now, there was no way to question him. Other than the 5 city-guarding crossbows and clothing clues, there was no progress in the investigation of the assassination of the imperial envoy. Although the emperor's expression remained calm, the officials who were fortunate enough to participate in the court conferences could all feel the anger hidden in the emperor's eyes growing stronger and stronger. However, they didn't know when this fire would spew out and burn these officials to ashes. Everyone knew why Sir Fan Jr. had rushed out of the capital last year when he had been appointed to Zhongnan Road as the imperial envoy with full authority. It was because the rumors from northern Qi had directly exposed the layer of secret relationship between the emperor and Sir Fan Jr. In order to prevent the situation in Jingdou from becoming unstable, to preserve the face of the royal family, and to allow the Qing court to escape from this awkward secret, the emperor had secretly banished Sir Fan Jr. to Zhongnan. No one had thought that once Fan Xian came to Zhongnan, he would do so many things. He regulated the palace treasury, presided over the bidding, and vigorously supported the river works. In less than half a year, with a flip of a hand, he had solved the problem of the empty national treasury that had troubled the Qing kingdom for a few years. In the end, he had used the opportunity of returning home to visit relatives to clean out the nest of rats in Jiaozhou. The deputy general of the Jiaozhou Navy, Dang Xiaobo, had long been escorted back to Jingdou. He had taken his confession and made it into an ironclad case. He had been executed in the autumn. The silver in the Zhongnan treasury had long been moved back to Jingdou. The court finally had the confidence to begin major repairs to the river dikes, disaster relief, and tax reductions. Each of these were Fan Xian's contributions to the Qing court. The officials all thought that such a figure could not always be left in Zhongnan. He would probably have to return to the capital in the end. Furthermore, the emperor must have thought that after a year, the news would have long faded. The powers in Jingdou would have learned to accept this kind of situation. The illegitimate child that had been banished to Zhongnan would finally be able to stand openly in court. No one had thought that on Sir Fan Jr.'s way back to the capital to debrief, he would be ambushed. This was not just an ambush on the imperial envoy or an ambush on a dragon. This matter had already touched the court's bottom line. If this matter could not be investigated clearly, it could only mean that the emperor's control over the Qing kingdom was already far from what it had been in the past. In the present day, when the battle for succession was gradually rising to the surface, this kind of signal was, without question, like a smear of red seeping out of a giant whale's wound in the ocean. It was enough to attract countless sharks to greedily come forward to fight for food. However, the case remained like a ball of fog. For a long time, it was impossible to see clearly what was going on inside. If it dragged on for a few more days, the emperor, in his anger, would probably disregard the consequences and strike down lightning as a severe punishment. The prudent officials in court were most afraid of this kind of situation. They were worried that the emperor, because of his heartache for Fan Xian and his pride, would, in a situation where there was no evidence, attack limitlessly and punish without limit, and expand this matter to a point that the Qing kingdom could not endure. Please reconsider, Your Majesty. An old official standing among the ranks of civil officials stepped forward and knelt under the dragon chair. A friend has come from afar. I want to have a good time first. I'm going to drink. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 452. Reconsider what? The Qing emperor raised his heavy eyelids. Recently, the signs of a snowstorm in the south had gradually appeared. There were more memorials from various provinces than the snowflakes floating down from the sky. If they didn't stretch out their hands to ask the court for silver, they wanted to recruit men, or they repeatedly complained that taxes were going to be reduced next year. If it was reduced, then so be it. That person was right. If they relied on digging for silver from the ground, even if they scraped 3 feet of the ground, they wouldn't be able to get many silver shavings. For something like silver, they still had to rely on selling things. And Ji had earned so much silver for the court in Jiangnan, so the court was not in a rush for the rice stock money from each county. However, Xueqi had sent an urgent message from Hangzhou. Was the snow in Jiangnan this heavy? The emperor furrowed his brows. In the autumn of the year before last, there had been a great flood. Who knew how many of his people had drowned and how many of their houses and fields had been destroyed? With great difficulty, it had taken more than a year for the imperial court to recover and accumulate some strength. Who would have thought that there would suddenly be another great snowfall? The heavens truly did not give him, the emperor, any face. However, he heard that the Hangzhou conference in Jiangnan seemed to have anticipated the winter snowstorm and made a great deal of preparations. After all, it was an organization of the people. When it came to disaster relief, they moved faster than the government. Every time this matter was brought up, his mother in the palace also had a smile on her face. She was a merciful person and could not bear to see the wretched sight of the people. No matter what, the Hangzhou conference was something the nobles in the palace had pooled together money to put together. The women in the palace all felt proud. The emperor couldn't resist smiling. Why did Chen girl put so much effort into this matter? It looked like she had indeed been stifled in the palace. She had probably been led astray by her husband. She was a princess, yet she spent so much effort on these matters. He abruptly woke up with a start. Only now did he realize that his mind had wandered. Even if it was something he was thinking about, it had something to do with that young man. After a slight pause, he smiled and repeated his question. Reconsider what? The person kneeling in the hall was Xu, the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. This scholar was old and had always received the emperor's respect. Furthermore, he had always walked in court as an outspoken official. Thus, when they were discussing the investigation of the assassination of the imperial envoy, only this scholar dared to stand out and refute the emperor's opinion. However, the officials all thought that the emperor must be angry right now, so they were a bit timid. Even Xu the scholar, who dared to speak frankly, did not bow like he usually did. Instead, he knelt. But he didn't think that His Majesty, who was sitting on the dragon throne, didn't hear what he said clearly and seemed to be distracted. The glimmer of a smile at the corners of the emperor's lips while he was lost in thought also fell into the eyes of the officials. The officials muttered in their hearts, wondering what the emperor was thinking about to make him so happy. Could it be that he was not as furious as the officials thought he was? Impossible. The officials shook their heads in their hearts. Everyone knew that the emperor favored this illegitimate child the most. Thus, in the hearts of these officials, who thought that they were naturally astute, this smile gained an additional mysterious and unfathomable meaning. Everyone's hearts trembled. Please reconsider, Your Majesty. Although the city guarding crossbow belongs to Dingzhou, this clue is a bit too. Xu Wu thought for a moment and didn't know what words to use. It is too obvious. I keep feeling that a true traitor is purposely framing us. Please reconsider and take back the earlier edict. The emperor smiled. Only now did he understand what Xu Wu was afraid of. Waving his hand, he said, "Stand up and reply. You are already so old. Don't easily learn from others and kneel to admonish." These words appeared very gentle, but the emperor's gentleness revealed a sense of confidence and stability. It was as if he didn't care about this matter at all. The officials had been worried about the emperor's control over the court earlier. Looking at this scene, they couldn't help but be speechless and blame themselves. How could they have been so muddle-headed? Who was the person on the dragon throne? He was the most valiant monarch since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Of course, I am not having Yi Zhong return to the capital for something as simple as debriefing. The emperor smiled slightly and gently stroked the short beard on his chin. Since the assassination of the imperial envoy has implicated him, of course, he has to explain. The Yi family has guarded the country's borders for generations and has performed meritorious deeds under heaven. Of course, I will not doubt it. However, there has to be a decision in this matter and a clear explanation. Xu Wu wiped the sweat from his forehead and climbed up from the ground with some difficulty. With Hu the scholar's support, he returned to the ranks. When he had first heard the emperor order Yi Zhong to return to the capital, he had thought that the emperor, in his anger, was going to directly throw Yi Zhong into prison to seek justice for his illegitimate child. Thus, in his fear, He had stepped out to admonish. Now that he heard this was not the case, he felt at ease. Although he was a civil official, he had been in court for a long time. He understood what the military meant to a country that had not even been founded for a century. Thus, he was very afraid that the emperor would wantonly humiliate and harass the military because of the assassination in the valley and shake the foundation of the court. Xu the scholar's heart was for the Qing kingdom, so he was at ease. However, the emperor's words fell into the ears of the other officials and had a different meaning. Why is the emperor suddenly so gentle toward the Yi family? It was because the emperor had not been gentle toward the Yi family in the past 2 years that the emperor had suddenly become gentle. For a moment, countless officials could not wrap their heads around it. However, the so-called might of an emperor was something the officials could not wrap their heads around. They still had to wrap their heads around. Thus, they all prostrated themselves on the ground and praised the emperor's wisdom and magnanimity. The emperor actually did not think too much about it. He was also not as angry as the officials imagined. As an emperor, he had to maintain a necessary sense of mystery and eternal calm to show that he was as unmoving as a mountain and that the world was in his hands. Furthermore, Fan Xian had not died. If Fan Xian had been killed in the valley, for the Qing emperor, it would be a criminal case. Since Fan Xian had not been killed, the criminal case had become a political matter. However, when great or muddle-headed politicians handled political matters, they all had a common trait. They were not in a hurry. The former were not in a hurry because they had a well-thought-out plan. The latter were not in a hurry because they didn't know how to act. The emperor was the former. However, he had an additional identity, so he still had an uncontrollable anger toward Fan Xian's assassination. As a father, what he wanted to do the most was to bring Fan Xian into the palace to see how his injuries were. However, this time, it was not an assassination in the Hanging Temple. He could not find any reason to bring Fan Xian into the palace. Later, he heard reports that Fan Xian had not been recovering in the manner for long before leaving the city for Chen Garden. The emperor knew that Fan Xian's injuries were not serious and relaxed. Do not forget, even if the Qing emperor was the coldest and most emotionless person in the world, no matter how much of a bastard he was still a bastard's father. Just as Chen Pingping and Fan Xian did their best to guess and test, the emperor always had a confidence that was difficult for the common people to reach, as well as a great ambition that had been hidden under his calm expression for a dozen years. As for the military's assassination this time, the emperor was shocked. Furthermore, even now, he was unable to completely find out which family had acted. He only had a faint guess, but he was not very worried. On the contrary, he welcomed the fact that someone had begun to challenge his authority, and cleverly guided the situation in the direction he needed. Everything in his own country had long ceased to arouse his interest. No matter how stable he ruled the Qing kingdom's territory, for him, who longed to leave his name in the annals of history, it was already meaningless, especially one with the most ink stains. He waited for that day with incomparable longing. He forcefully suppressed his excitement as he waited for the arrival of that day. "Your Majesty." A eunuch knelt outside the doorsill of the royal study and respectfully said to the emperor wearing a large brocade robe on the couch, "I've checked with the council." In the days before Sir Fan Jr. returned to the capital, all the manners were quiet. The emperor nodded his head to indicate that he understood. "Has news from Congzhou come back?" The eunuch's buttocks rose a little higher. In a gentle voice, he said, "Governor Yan left the camp to return to the capital. There was nothing strange along the way." The emperor waved his hand and had the head eunuch retreat. The head eunuch didn't say more. However, his hand on the ground trembled slightly. He thought, there is still news from Dingzhou that hasn't been reported back. Why hasn't the emperor returned? Has he already predicted? Or is he preparing to blame it on the Yi family? What do you think? The emperor casually picked up a book from the side of the couch and flipped through it. The old eunuch Hong slowly walked out. He bowed slightly to the emperor's side and slowly said, "How could I have any opinions?" The emperor smiled and said, "Everyone has their own opinion." Eunuch Hong gently coughed. After a moment of silence, he said, "I think that Sir Fan Jr.'s assassination in the valley this time is truly strange. I keep feeling that it was arranged by someone. However, I cannot understand why someone with the power to arrange this would harm Sir Fan Jr." The emperor threw the book in his hand to the side. After a moment of silence, he said, "Don't speak of this." "Yes, Your Majesty." Eunuch Hong bowed. A moment later, he quietly said,
The Empress Dowager invites your majesty to sit in Hongguang Palace in a moment. The emperor smiled warmly and said, Is there a need for you to say this? Eunuch Hong hesitated for a moment and then said, There is news from outside the palace that has entered the Empress Dowager's ears.
She seems to be a bit depressed.
The emperor furrowed his brows slightly and asked, What news?
First, after that lawyer, Song Shuren, returned to the capital, his mouth has not shut. He is still discussing the Jiangnan Ming family lawsuit.
Eunuch Hong carefully glanced at the emperor's expression and asked, The Empress Dowager does not like it.
The emperor's expression was slightly icy. His finger unconsciously tapped on the wooden table. Song Shuren was the person who had helped Fan Xian with the lawsuit in Jiangnan. He had argued continuously in the Suzhou government for 3 months. What he had talked about was the issue of the eldest legitimate son's right to inheritance in Qing law. This lawyer had some reputation in the capital. Presumably, he was a clever person. How could he have spread this matter so widely after returning to the capital?
Thinking of this, the emperor immediately understood that someone must have arranged it.
The Empress Dowager must also know, which was why she was unhappy. After all, the Empress Dowager still loved her grandson, the Crown Prince.
Have that lawyer shut his mouth, the emperor said coldly. After pausing for a moment, he then coldly said, But, don't make him disappear.
He is Fan Xian's person. I have to give the child some face.
Eunuch Hong restrained his voice and quietly made a sound of acknowledgement.
However, he did not leave immediately.
What else is there?
Eunuch Hong's withered expression did not change.
In a quiet voice he said, The palace heard.
Sir Fan Jr. obtained a good sword in Jiangnan. It was sent by the head of the Overwatch Council stationed in northern Qi, Wang Qinian. The soft skin under the emperor's left eye couldn't help but jump a few times.
He forcefully suppressed a glimmer of annoyance in his heart and warmly said, I understand. Walking under the damp vermilion and black palace walls, passing by the winter and cold-resistant golden thread willows in the garden, the lake in the palace had already frozen over. The autumn grass did not have the honor of receiving the auspicious snow, and had long been cleared away by the servants and eunuchs.
Along the way, a patch of cleanliness hid the desolation. The emperor walked in front with his hands behind his back through the spacious palace. No one dared to come too close around him. Behind him, Eunuch Yao led a group of young eunuchs. Holding coats, warmers, and small hand stoves, he followed behind with small quick steps. Before long, he came to a quiet little courtyard. There was a building in the courtyard. A small building. It was the small building where the emperor and Fan Xian had their first heart-to-heart talk. The emperor pushed open the door and entered. Casually brushing away a few snowflakes drifting down from the top of the door, he went straight up to the second floor. Eunuch Yao took the items from the hands of the young eunuchs and gave a few reminders. He then also entered the little courtyard but did not go upstairs. He could only wait quietly downstairs. At the same time, he began to boil water and prepare tea. The emperor stood in the side room on the second floor. His eyes looked at the painting on the wall. He looked at the yellow-clothed woman in the painting gazing at the river bank. He did not speak for a long time. He was only silent. Although his eyes were focused on her, his heart was thinking of something else. Sword. Naturally, it was the sword of the Wei Emperor that Wang Qinian had bought from northern Qi for a great deal of money to honor Ji. Lawyer? The emperor smiled coldly. Ji had been killed and heavily injured, but those people were still unwilling to be quiet. His mother's attitude toward Ji was already calm.
Without asking, he knew that these things were instigated by his good sister and the empress.
Half a year ago, Li Yunrui had arranged for someone to enter the palace to tell the Empress Dowager about Dream of the Red Chamber. The emperor knew what his sister was planning. Today, the lawyer and the sword. Naturally, she wanted to provoke his mother into anger. There were many rules in the royal family. An official secretly holding the sword of the former Wei emperor was indeed inexcusable. However, Ji was still injured, yet those people couldn't help but want to do something. This contrast made the emperor faintly angry. After a long time, a sigh broke the silence in the little building. The emperor slowly turned and sat down in front of the painting. His left hand gently stroked an item on the table. Under his slender and steady palm was that sword. The sword of the Wei Emperor that Wang Qinian had bought for a great deal of money and sent to Jiangnan. A slight smile rose to the corners of the emperor's lips.
Presumably, those people did not know that the second day after Fan Xian woke up, he had asked someone to deliver this sword into the palace and into the emperor's hands. There was also a secret letter attached. There was nothing special in the letter. There were no major complaints about the assassination. Instead, it was just sincere and respectful with an occasional hint of viciousness. This glimmer of viciousness was well revealed. It was revealed very openly. As a ruler, the emperor valued the hearts of the people by his side the most, just as he had thought when he spoke with Chen Pingping that day. Honesty was one aspect of it. Before and after, Fan Xian appeared very honest, but the rest of his sons and officials were not honest at all. He sat like this under the painting, slightly tired and worried. The yellow-clothed woman in the painting was also slightly tired and worried. Just like this, one in the painting and one outside, the two of them rested at the same time. After a long time, the usual unswerving and steady expression reappeared on the emperor's face. Standing, he flipped his hand around the emperor's sword Fan Xian had presented and walked downstairs. Eunuch Yao carefully handed over a cup of tea. The emperor took a sip and handed over the sword. Calmly he said, "Pass on my edict. The commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, is loyal to the country and has deeply comforted my heart. He is specially bestowed with a treasured sword." Eunuch Yao hurriedly accepted it. In the end, the emperor lightly said, "Summon Yan Bingyun, He Zhongwei, and Qin Heng into the palace." He said the names of a dozen officials. These people all had one thing in common. They were all young. Eunuch Yao accepted the order and left the building. He sent out various eunuchs to various places to pass on the information. He then left the palace himself. Escorted by guards, he arrived at the Fan Manor. There was no need for incense or firecrackers. He entered the back garden and gave the sword wrapped in a yellow cloth to the young man. Everything was normal. However, this matter was recorded. Presumably, everyone in Jingdo would know about it tomorrow. Fan Xian held the sword in a daze, thinking, why was the emperor so polite? The young officials who had rushed into the palace were also wary and secretly guessing the emperor's thoughts. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 453. Fan Xian held the sword and smiled bitterly. After his father entered the room, he immediately put on his most sincere smile and said, "Father, you're back so early?" Fan Jian nodded and sat down in front of the bed. There hasn't been much to do in the Ministry of Revenue recently, so there's no need to stay there all the time. After saying this, he handed over an oiled paper bag and said, "Buns from Xinfeng restaurant. The third prince has been silently studying these 2 days." The old man thought that he had been outside for a year and watched him closely. Although he knew of your injury, he couldn't come out for a while. He only remembered that you liked Xinfeng restaurant buns, so he had someone buy them and deliver them to you. Fan Xian accepted the still warm paper bag and took out one from inside. Carefully taking a bite, he found that the oily soup in the large bag was not very hot. Fan Jian looked at his son's appearance and couldn't help but furrow his brows and shake his head. Fan Xian took a bite and then placed the paper bag on the table. Unconsciously, he turned his head to glance at the snow on the windowsill. A glimmer of envy appeared in his eyes. "Don't think about going out again." Fan Jian saw what his son was thinking and coldly said, "The day before yesterday, I let you slip out and go to Qin Garden. Be content. Jingdo is snowing and the roads are slippery. You're also injured, yet you don't know how to behave yourself." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, "Am I really that popular? It's not like everyone wants to stab me with a knife. Besides, in Jingdo, would there actually be people who would dare to make a move?" Fan Jian smiled coldly and said, "The inside and outside of Jingdo are only a dozen li away. What difference do you think it makes?" He was silent for a moment and then quietly said, "It's best if you calm down for now. The emperor will naturally seek justice for you." Fan Xian's mouth respectfully agreed, but in his heart, he was thinking of a completely different matter. Both Chen Pingping and Fan Jian seemed to be watching the emperor's attitude. The two old men also had their own private actions. However, they both hid it from Fan Xian and didn't want him to get too involved. However, Fan Xian knew that the one who was injured was him. He was also the first to bear the brunt. Blindly enduring it was not in line with his principles. As for what the emperor would do next, Fan Xian could vaguely guess a little through his conversation with Chen Pingping. However, the change of blood in court did not seem to have much to do with him. After his father left the room, Fan Xian rolled his eyes and stretched. He tested the wound on his back and found that it was almost healed. His medical skills and his freakish physique made him very suitable for a life of dancing on the edge of a sword.
He got out of bed and put on his clothes and shoes. He tried to be as quiet as possible so as not to disturb the maids serving him outside.
Sitting on a stool by the table, he frowned and thought for a moment, and decided that the box should be safe to leave as it was. There were many clever people in the world, but those who were too clever would never think that they would do such a thing.
After making up his mind, he gently pushed open the innermost cotton curtain. A gust of hot air came from the incense burner in the outer room. He crushed a pill between his fingers, and its fragrance gradually filled the air. The sluggish maid was already feeling sleepy by the incense burner. She was startled to see her young master come out, but when she smelled the fragrance, she immediately fell asleep again. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and looked at the maid's charmingly naive appearance. He couldn't resist smiling. It looked like Xueqi, that girl, would be enchanted by him for the rest of her life. Warner had thought it would be a long journey to Hangzhou, so she hadn't brought this girl. Unexpectedly, he still had to send her to sleep after returning to the capital. Wrapping himself in a thick fur cloak, Fan Xian carefully snuck along the corridor toward the back door. Presently, the Teng couple were both in the manor. Their control over the servants had always been lax. In this snowy day, if the master did not give any orders, the servants and maids liked to hide in the room and laze around. Coincidentally, no one discovered Fan Xian's act of leaving the house. Of course, when he was about to approach the metal door, there were always guards standing there. However, Fan Xian glared at them, and the guards could only pretend to be mute. In the end, the young master and the old master were both masters. It would not do to offend either of them. Easily leaving the manor, Fan Xian climbed into the normal carriage. Mu Feng carefully helped him into the carriage and then carefully sealed the cotton curtains around the window. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "I just wanted to see some scenery." "What if you've sealed it?" Mu Feng smiled and didn't say anything more. Putting on a raincoat, he covered the Overwatch Council robe inside. With a shake of his wrist, the horsewhip made a few turns in the air, bringing down a few snowflakes. The carriage slowly began to move. The swordsman of the 6th Bureau followed in the dark. There were also some Overwatch Council secret agents disguised as passers-by who merged into the small number of Jingdo pedestrians. The carriage traveled to a lively part of Jingdo and carefully avoided pedestrians. Fan Xian lifted a corner of the curtain and looked out. He saw that the shops on both sides of the street were still open. The vendors selling snacks held up large umbrellas and used the heat in their pots to resist the harsh winter temperature. Compared to a year ago, there was nothing strange. He couldn't help but smile. For the court, the imperial envoy being assassinated was indeed a major matter. For these common people, presumably, it was the most delightful topic of conversation these few days. However, it could not affect them too much. Those who needed to do small business still had to do small business. Those who needed to worry about the surplus food in their homes still had to worry about it. His being assassinated made the court restless. It did not change much for the daily life that had been the same for tens of thousands of years. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He stared at a few people on the neighboring street and did not move his gaze for a moment. Those people, who clearly looked like aces, were warily surrounding and protecting a young man. It was clear that the young man had disguised himself, but how could he hide it from Fan Xian's eyes? His heart jumped. "Follow them," Fan Xian ordered in an urgent voice as he watched the group of people buy some things and climb into his carriage. Mu made a sound of acknowledgement. He gently lifted the reins and followed. The two carriages, one in front and one behind, circled around the busy street and turned into a relatively quiet and luxurious street. At this time, it was still early. The winter entertainment had not yet begun, so the buildings on the street were all quiet. Only the brothel in the best position in the middle of the street had red lanterns hanging high. Heavy curtains blocked the wind and used the spring scenery inside to attract the male creatures in the cold wind and bitter snow outside. It was Jingdo's most famous Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian watched as the group of people got off the carriage and walked into the building. He furrowed his brows and wondered if his eyes were really blurry after his injury.
His head was full of questions. Without thinking, he had Mu Feng drive the carriage into the inner courtyard of Baoyue brothel from a side road and stop outside the door by the lake behind the building. He was the true boss of Baoyue brothel. The housemaid waiting at the back door saw him come down from the carriage and jumped in fright. She thought to herself, "Is this master heavily injured? How could he still have the leisure to come to the brothel to inspect?" She didn't say anything. She quickly sent someone to inform the second shopkeeper, Xueqi, and carefully led Fan Xian to the prettiest independent courtyard by the lake. Fan Xian shook his head and thought of the person he had seen earlier. He passed directly through the snow by the lake and slowly walked toward Baoyue brothel. Going up to the third floor and coming to the room of the exclusive owner, Fan Xian composed himself and listened to the light words coming from inside. He couldn't resist the corners of his lips twitching slightly and smiling. The old housemaid behind him didn't say anything. She didn't even dare to cough. Earlier, she had sent someone to inform the second shopkeeper, but she had no choice. She only hoped with all her heart that the people inside the room would be careful with what they said. After listening quietly for a long time, Fan Xian pushed open the door and entered. "Who is it?" With a hiss, the sound of a curved knife being unsheathed rang out. A heart-chilling knife intent hit him in the face. However, Fan Xian didn't hide or avoid it. He walked forward with an ugly expression. The person who had drawn out the knife wore normal clothing, but his brows were full of vigilance and steadiness. The knife had never been pulled back. Seeing that the young nobleman in front of him didn't even avoid it, he knew something was wrong and forcefully pulled the knife back. Xueqi clashed and his face flushed red. Mu Feng, who followed behind Fan Xian, also entered. He turned and closed the door. He then smiled warmly at the knife-wielding man, thinking that they would be colleagues in the future. At the same time, the group of people who had entered the room first had already abruptly stood up and surrounded Fan Xian, who was walking in front. Following this were two crisp sounds. The tea bowls in the hands of a woman and a young man fell to the ground at the same time. The two of them stared dumbstruck at Fan Xian and couldn't speak for a moment. "All of you, put down your knives." The young man came to his senses first and cursed angrily at his followers. "Do you want to die?" The followers looked at each other, wondering who had come to make the big boss so agitated. Fan Xian was not agitated. He walked in front of the young man, bent two fingers slightly, and knocked down viciously. With a pop, a red dot immediately appeared on the young man's slightly plump face. "You want to die?" Fan Xian cursed angrily. "Who told you to come back?" The young man pursed his lips and said with great grievance, "Brother, I miss home." Everyone dared to leave the room. Even Xueqi, who wanted to defend the young man, was chased out by Fan Xian. Only then did he walk boldly to the chair in the center and sit down. Looking at the respectful young man in front of him, he didn't speak for a moment. After a long silence, Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "The big boss is very powerful now. He has Northern Qi aces as bodyguards by his side. It looks like I don't have much of a presence as a brother." The young man in front of him was no stranger. He was the business genius who had been chased to Northern Qi by Fan Xian a year ago. He had now completely taken over the business routes of the Cui family, and managed the smuggling business between the Northern Qi royal family and Fan Xian in Jiangnan. He was the second son of the Fan Manor, the one with the annoying pockmarks on his face. Fan Xija. Fan Xija moved closer to his brother and carefully rubbed his arm. In a small voice he giggled and said, "With money, what kind of ace can't we invite?" Fan Xian was angry and angrily scolded, "Why did you sneak back like this? Don't you know the wanted posters are still up all over the world?" Fan Xija smiled and said, "That's just a piece of scrap paper. I glanced at it at the Zhangzhou gate. It has long been soaked in the rain. How could it still recognize me?" Fan Xian couldn't resist scolding, "Don't keep smiling. Tell me what happened. Why did you sneak back? Why didn't you tell me beforehand?" Fan Xija was momentarily speechless. He scratched his head for a while and then said, "In a few days, it will be father's birthday." Only now did Fan Xian remember this matter. Looking at his brother's face, which was clearly much thinner than a year ago, he couldn't resist sighing. He thought of how he had been alone in Northern Qi for more than a year and had to deal with so many complicated matters at such a young age. It was truly pitiful. His heart softened. He couldn't bear to scold him anymore. He shook his head and said, "If you're going back, then you're going back.
You should at least tell me beforehand.
Fan Xija felt wronged and said, if I was going to tell you first, you definitely wouldn't agree. Fan Xian suddenly thought of a problem and furrowed his brows.
Where is Lao Wang? He's watching you in Shangjing. Why didn't he tell me you left?
He huffed coldly and looked at his brother without saying anything.
Fan Xija's eyes spun around a few times. He was slightly anxious. A moment later, he hesitantly said, Didn't Sir Wang also come back?
I followed him all the way into the pass. Brother, don't blame him. Fan Xian slammed the table and roared angrily. This old shameless fellow also came early?
Why didn't he tell me? You guys are truly rebelling.
You dare to hide everything from me. Fan Xija trembled and didn't dare to say more.
He knew that if this brother of his was truly angry and hit someone, he could really bear to use his foot to kick them.
Since you're back, why didn't you go home?
Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Fan Xija was slightly startled. Immediately after, a glimmer of ruthlessness rose to his face.
Brother, as soon as I entered the capital yesterday, I heard about that matter.
I was afraid that going home right now would cause you trouble. Also, the court still hasn't found anything, right? I wanted to see if there was any news from Baoyue brothel, so I stayed here first to see if I could help you. Fan Xian had actually overheard these words from outside the room.
Hearing it from his brother's own mouth now, he was even more moved. He gently patted his head and sighed. What trouble are you afraid of? It's not like the emperor doesn't know about your matter.
Who would dare to do anything? Come home with me in a bit. As for news of Baoyue brothel, if I need it, I will have someone come ask. You are a proper businessman. Don't get involved in these things.
He couldn't resist glaring at his brother again and said, Don't think I don't know what you're thinking in that head of yours.
You're afraid that I'll scold you directly when you come home, so you want to do something to make me happy. Don't play this game with me. Use this on your parents. We haven't seen each other for over a year. Don't think about how Aunt Lu misses you. How can you bear to stay outside? If this matter goes up, see how your mother will deal with you. I won't ask for leniency.
Fan Xija nodded his head in grievance. He thought to himself, It's all because of your accumulated power that I'm afraid of approaching the manor and not knocking.
You've grown a bit taller. Fan Xian looked at him with a smile and patted his shoulder. After not seeing him for a year, his heart was also excited and happy. You've also grown a bit stronger. Looks like you've been doing well in Northern Qi.
Fan Xija was just about to complain and tell on his future sister-in-law when he heard the sound of knocking on the door.
This knocking sound was very gentle and careful. It was like crying and complaining, like the pain of losing a father. Fan Xian laughed coldly. Get your ass in here. You're a supporting character. Don't pretend to be sorrowful here. I've read all the book reviews seriously. Some are very interesting, but the new versions have been refined. I'm really not familiar with them. Everyone, wait for a while. It's probably because I'm too lazy. I've been drinking too much these past 2 days. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.qidi.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 454. The unknown sidekick, Wang Qinian, pushed open a crack and flashed in. The 40-year-old old man was as nimble as a 14-year-old child. His attitude was humble, but the wandering gaze that occasionally flashed through his eyes betrayed the fear in his heart. Fan Xian had been incomparably happy to see him, but when he thought about how this guy had brought Xija back to the Qing kingdom behind his back and hadn't even secretly reported it, he felt a sliver of anger in his heart. He turned his head and continued to frown at Fan Xija. Presumably, the news of you in Shangjing couldn't be hidden from anyone. There was Wei Hua's brocade guard there to protect you. Yet, after returning home, you have to be even more careful about your personal safety. You have to be cautious. Like today, you took your attendants out on the streets. Although you were disguised, you little tyrant, know many people in the capital. Then there are your attendants.
I know you hired a group of Northern Qi aces, but... He was a bit angry at his brother's carelessness.
You still had those curved knives hanging from your waist. Only a blind person would not be able to tell they were Northern Qi people. I say, Your talent for business is something that even the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall admire greatly. How could you be so careless with these little things? To the side, Wang Qinian wanted to interrupt, but he didn't dare to speak. Fan Xizha glanced at the little old man with sympathy and carefully explained, I used the identity of a northern Qi merchant group. Fan Xian didn't pay attention to his explanation and coldly said, in any case, coming back without permission is your problem. Looking at his brother's back, Fan Xizha rolled his eyes and came up with a plan. He chuckled and said, if we're talking about acting on your own. Big brother, I heard that you were injured quite badly in that valley. I think father would definitely not allow you to go out and wander around. Why did you see me on the street? Fan Xian stopped and didn't know what to say. He huffed coldly and let it go. Shortly after he said evenly, let's not talk about that. It's good that you're back. I haven't seen you for over a year. I really do miss you. Fan Xizha sighed and sat by Fan Xian's side. Hugging his arm, he complained, I've been taking care of business for the second half of the year. Although it's annoying to argue with those northern Qi people and split profits, I've always been doing what I like. You don't know about the first few months. The scene of a snowy night, a stone mill, a donkey, and beans seemed to appear before the young man's eyes. He said with a trembling voice, that's not a life for humans. Fan Xian suddenly realized that Haitang had long since returned to Shangjing. He couldn't help but laugh. Are you in a hurry to run away now that she's back in Shangjing? How can you be so timid?
Feeling wronged, Fan Xizha said, brother, not all men in this world are as good as you.
You can deceive any kind of girl. I don't want to look at a tigress like Haitang. Fan Xian laughed heartily and asked a few more questions about his brother's life in the north.
As for official business, the two of them had talked about it countless times in the letters they had exchanged.
He was too lazy to ask again.
He just listened to his brother talk about his life in Shangjing and how he, at such a young age, came and went in and out of Shangjing's manners and nobility. Especially when he heard that Fan Xizha had become a frequent guest of the Marquis of Chongningho's house and often competed with Wei Hua's father in drinking, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. He thought that the old man's body might not be able to withstand the drinking battle between the two of them. Thinking of the old man in Shangjing, his gaze fell on the unusually quiet old man beside him.
Fan Xian's mood had been good for a long time. He looked at Wang Qinian with a warm smile.
His thin lips opened slightly and he said quietly, Sir Wang, I trust you have been well. Anyone who had interacted with Fan Xian knew that when Sir Fan Jr.'s smile was at its warmest, it was when the evil fire in his heart burned brightly.
At such a time, no one wanted to provoke this good-looking young man. As Fan Xian's confidant, Wang Qinian knew his temper well.
Seeing the smile at the corner of his lips, his heart trembled. With a pained expression he said, Sir, spare me. When did you get here?
Fan Xian picked up the teacup next to him and took 2 sips to moisten his throat.
He noticed that the teacup had the fragrance of rouge, and only then did he realize that it had been drunk by Si Qing.
He frowned slightly and switched to his brother's cup. But then he thought of something else.
He tilted his head and asked, Where is your woman?
These 2 questions were directed at 2 different people. Fan Xizha laughed and said, She's in Shangjing, tied up all day. It's a bit boring. Wang Qinian said honestly, I really did get here yesterday.
I already went to the council to report to Sir Yen, but the council said that you weren't feeling well after your injury, and told me not to rush into the manor.
Fan Xian glared at his brother, thinking that this kid was going to be 16 this year. Why did he sound like a middle-aged married man?
But then he thought about how Fan Xizha had started a brothel at such a young age, and how he had taken advantage of it at such a young age.
It would be difficult for him to know what it meant to cherish women. He frowned and asked Wang Qinian, You should know the arrangements for your return. Wang Qinian straightened his body and laughed. I heard that you want me to take over your position in the first bureau. I won't do it. Fan Xian was startled and opened his mouth to scold him. Even the director guessed that you would say that. That is the only brothel out of the 8 bureaus. If you don't take over such a good position, how can I rest assured? You've been in Northern Qi for a year and a half. Your seniority and experience are all here. If I don't let you go, the others in the council will probably think otherwise.
Wang Qinian thought for a moment and then said seriously, Sir Mu is good in the first bureau. As for me...
He shook his head and sighed. I'm an old man with a wife and daughter at home. I thought I would slowly spend the rest of my life in the council yamen until I died of old age. I didn't expect you to bring me out. These few years have been stressful and exciting, but I still feel that it is more comfortable working by your side. Always by my side, Fan Xian muttered to himself. He also liked the fact that the Qinian unit by his side was managed by Lao Wang. During these 2 years, the Qinian unit was first given to Deng Ziyu and then to Su Wan Mao. In the last half year, it was basically Hong Chongqing who was in charge. These 3 people were all very observant and sensitive people, and there was no problem with their loyalty to him. However, Fan Xian always felt that it was not as happy as when he first entered the capital. He gazed at Wang Qinian and said with a slight smile, "It won't always be calm. In the valley, many people have died." The room immediately fell silent. After a long time, Wang Qinian said seriously, "Because of this, I still feel that you should let me handle the matters around you. At least my nose is sharper and I run faster. Although the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau are capable, I have more confidence in myself when it comes to taking precautions." Fan Xian lowered his head. His fingers twirled around the little teacup as he calculated his future plans. He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Wang Qinian appeared comical, but when he did things, he was watertight. During this year in northern Qi, Fan Xian didn't have to spend much effort to successfully build a good relationship with the northern Qi royal family and the Brocade Guard Yamen. Furthermore, he had the northern Qi spy network of the 6th Bureau, which had become a pool of dead water because of Yan Bingyun's accidental exposure, successfully become active again. The smuggling of the Jiangnan Palace treasury to northern Qi and Fan Xian's understanding of northern Qi's movements all relied on this wizened old man in front of him. These matters all proved Wang Qinian's abilities. This quiet but powerful Overwatch Council official was a treasure Fan Xian had picked up after entering the capital. Fan Xian wanted him to take over the 1st Bureau in hopes that he could secretly spy on the Jingdo officials for him. When turbulent waves arrived in Jingdo, he would have a trusted aide who could control the overall situation. If Wang Qinian only returned to his side and became the head of the Qinian unit, in Fan Xian's opinion, it would be a waste. However, Wang Qinian was very insistent. Fan Xian was in a difficult position. He furrowed his brows and said, "We'll discuss this again. However, at the end of the year, hand over the affairs in the north to Ziyue. Be more careful. He has no experience operating outside the borders. Teach him more." Wang Qinian knew that the commissioner had tacitly agreed to his request and couldn't resist smiling. Fan Xizhe watched as his brother began to deal with Overwatch Council affairs. He felt that it was inappropriate for him to continue sitting there. He stood and prepared to leave. The Baoyue brothel has already opened 6 branches in the world, and the branch in Shangjing in northern Qi is about to open as well. You have to pay attention to all the intelligence gathering. I will leave the south to Sangwen, and I will leave the north to you. Since you are now an unofficial member of the council, there is no harm in you listening to the things that have happened today. In a bit, when Deng Ziyu comes over, you have to get close to him. Although he is my subordinate, in the coming year in northern Qi, the 2 of you have to work together. You cannot be too self-conscious. How about that? You can't be too self-conscious. How about that? This was Fan Xian's most pressing thought after the attack in the valley. He had to build up his own intelligence system. This system didn't need to be too big. It needed to absorb nutrients from the big tree that was the Overwatch Council. Otherwise, once the Overwatch Council became mute and closed itself off, Fan Xian was worried that it would be like the valley and he would once again become blind. As he spoke, there was a knock on the door. The person who came was using the Overwatch Council's standard method of reporting to a superior. Fan Xian smiled and made a sound of acknowledgement. Deng Ziyu, dressed in a black robe, pushed open the door and entered. He knelt on one knee in greeting to Fan Xian. After he rose, he looked at Wang Qinian to Fan Xian's side and said excitedly, "Sir Wang, you've returned to the capital?" Back when Fan Xian had formed the Qinian unit, he had only picked Wang Qinian. The subordinates after that had all been personally picked by Wang Qinian. Deng Ziyu was the first person Wang Qinian had picked into the group, so he had always viewed Wang Qinian as a teacher and a superior. Suddenly seeing him today, he couldn't help but be happy. "All right." Fan Xian smiled. "There's no need to talk about parting in this building today. We'll talk about the arrangements after they've settled." He paused and then asked, "How many more days until Wan Er and the others arrive?"
3 more days, Deng Ziyu replied calmly. There are Tiger Guard swordsmen accompanying them all the way. Additionally, after hearing that you were assassinated, the various provinces are on alert and have strengthened their defenses. There shouldn't be any problems. Fan Xian nodded. He was actually not very worried. Assassinations always had to have benefits. For those people, killing him was too tempting, but assassinating other members of the royal family had no benefit at all. The room was silent. Fan Xian was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. The other two were high-ranking officials of the same level as the heads of the 8 bureaus. It was the first time Fan Xija had participated in a council meeting of this level. He felt that the atmosphere was very different from when he was gathering merchants in the north to pick up girls and calculate money. He couldn't help feeling nervous and unconsciously played with his thick and clumsy fingers. However, Fan Xian remained silent. After a long silence, Wang Qinian opened his mouth and asked, "Sir, is someone else coming?" Fan Xian nodded and furrowed his brows slightly. "He should be coming." Wang Qinian scratched his head and said, "I arranged to meet with the second young master here."
Ziyu was notified by you. Who else?
Fan Xian smiled and said, "Right now, all the powers in Jingdo know that the Baoyue brothel is my territory. I don't know how many eyes are watching this place. What we are talking about here, I'm afraid it will soon spread to the various manors. That kid will not relax his watch on this place." He slowly lowered his head and said, "Since he knows I am here, why won't he come?" Wang Qinian sensed a glimmer of something else in these words. After a long time, a steady knocking sound rang out for the 3rd time that day on that quiet wooden door. A young man pushed open the door and entered. His clothes were whiter than snow. His brows were cold and frosty, and the coldness of his entire body suppressed the fluttering snow outside Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. The gloominess between his brows was swept away. His face broke into a smile. "You came quickly." The white-clothed man didn't want to joke with him and coldly said, "Sir, as the commissioner with full power of the Overwatch Council, you should know that your life is not just your business alone." At this moment, everyone in the room quickly rose and bowed. "Greeting," they said. "Greetings, Sir Yan." The person who came was Fan Xian's brain, the always icy Yan Bingyun. The 5 people in the room were all powerful figures of the Overwatch Council's new generation. Strangely, these 5 people were also the key figures who had clashed head-on with the second prince a year ago because of the Baoyue brothel matter. On the night Fan Xian chased Fan Xija out of Jingdo, these 5 people had all been together. Other than the Black Knight Jinggu who was far away in the camp outside the capital, Su Wenmao who stayed in Jiangnan to deal with palace treasury matters, and the Mu uncle and nephew outside the room, as well as Hong Chongqing who was keeping records in the council, this room was all of Fan Xian's direct subordinates in the Overwatch Council. Everyone sat down. Fan Xian gazed at Yan Bingyun with a not quite there smile. Using his index finger to rub between his brows, he said, "3 things." Everyone listened quietly. Even Yan Bingyun clasped his hands together slightly. "First, the emperor has summoned 14 young officials into the palace," Fan Xian said calmly. "The court wants to change a batch of blood, but I don't know how much of a commotion it will cause. By tomorrow, send the files and information of these 14 people to me. Those who can be controlled, immediately begin to control them. For those who cannot be controlled, find out the illegal things they did when they were still wearing open pants. We also have to think of a way to control them." Wearing open pants. Naturally, they had to dig deep into the deepest parts of the officials' souls. Everyone in the room was silent. They felt slightly uneasy. When the court selected officials, it did sometimes require the Overwatch Council to first examine their past official experiences. However, for the commissioner to order them like this, it was clear that they were not working for the court, but Fan Xian knew that his trusted aides had all understood and didn't explain much. Because of his assassination attempt, the emperor would certainly take the opportunity to do something. For him, this was a rare opportunity. Other than a few people, these young officials did not have any obvious factions. Because they were clean and had no powerful backers, it gave Fan Xian a chance to secretly interfere in court politics. Yan Bingyun suddenly shook his head and said, "Even mine have to be given?" Among the 14 young officials, Yan Bingyun's name was also on the list. This had only happened a few hours ago. Yan Bingyun had left the palace and knew that Fan Xian had come to Baoyue brothel, so he had hurried over.
He also knew that there were not many things in Jingdo that could be hidden from Fan Xian's eyes and ears. If it's fake, then write one, Fan Xian said without good humor. There's no need for Qin Heng. The council's files are clear. The main point is he's own way. This person looks like the emperor admires him.
He immediately smiled coldly and said, "But
I don't admire him."
the second matter, Fan Xian said quietly. There is a spy in the council.
After Xueqi died, the internal disputes seem to have weakened. Drag him out.
I don't want any more problems in the future.
Yan Bingyun smiled and didn't say anything. Fan Xian did not smile and glared at him.
The third matter. He looked at Yan Bingyun and said,
prepare some paper and prepare to wipe the council's mess. I'm going to kill a few people.
Kill who?
Yan Bingyun met Fan Xian's forceful gaze and calmly asked, if it is a high-ranking official, I object. After the assassination this time, the emperor can no longer tolerate it. If you act rashly, it will not help matters. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly.
His palm unconsciously rubbed the head of his brother beside him.
Raising his head, he said, killing is not the goal. It is also not a method to obtain some kind of benefit. It is only a kind of warning and provocation. Presumably, you know a little about Director Chen's intentions. You should know that adding a little more fuel to the fire at this time is good for the bigger picture. The other people didn't understand and didn't know what Director Chen meant by the bigger picture. However, Yan Bingyun felt bitterness in his mouth. He forced a smile and said, if you want to mess around, then mess around. It's just very childish revenge and venting anger. Don't tie it to the bigger picture. I want revenge. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and said. You are all my people. The people who died in the valley are also my people. Since my people have died, their people must also die. In the end, he gave orders to his most trusted subordinates. The day before Wan returns to the capital, I will hold a banquet in Baoyue brothel. I have invited the Crown Prince, the Great Prince, the Second Prince, Qin Heng, and the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs. Prepare. Governor Yan? Wang Qinian noticed that Fan Xian had left out an important figure in the eldest princess's faction and reminded him. To be continued, if you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 455.
There's no need.
Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. Losing a son at an old age, I'm afraid this super ace will go crazy when he arrives and slaughter the royal family in this brothel. How will I explain it to the emperor then? Everyone in the room felt their hearts skip a beat. They understood the meaning behind Fan Xian's words. These people were Fan Xian's trusted aides, so they knew what kind of tenacious and gloomy heart the commissioner had under his gentle exterior. Naturally, they did not think he was being facetious. Yan Bingyun finally could not suppress the shock in his heart. He raised his head and asked, is it necessary? Fan Xian nodded calmly. His index finger was still rubbing between his brows as if he wanted to rub away all of the gloom these days. Danzhou is good. Jingdo is difficult. Since the 2 sides in the end are in a situation of life and death, I'm used to acting first. Among the people present, Fan Xizha was closest to Fan Xian. However, he was too young. Hearing people like his elder brothers discuss a certain person's life and death so blatantly, he was unable to react. The others did not dare question Fan Xian's orders. Only Yan Bingyun persisted and said, it's not a good thing to explode early. Fan Xian shook his head and explained, it won't explode early. The emperor will certainly think of a way to turn the matter of me being assassinated into something beneficial for the court. However, for the council, I'm afraid it won't be of any benefit. After saying a few more words about the future matters of the Overwatch Council in Jingdo, this secret brothel meeting ended. Chen Pingping was basically no longer in charge of matters. The old leaders of the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council calmly made way. Fan Xian and Yan Bingyun discussed and could basically confirm most of the matters. Wang Qinian and Deng Ziyu left first and began to prepare the matters the commissioner had ordered. As Yan Bingyun left, he couldn't resist turning his head and furrowing his brows. Killing Yan Xiaoyi's son. This is admittedly a very serious warning,
but it will also drive a ferocious tiger crazy. Presumably, you have other plans in your heart that you have not made clear.
Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, "Correct, I won't hide this from you. As a superior 9th level ace, Xueqi is the martial and military power the other party can rely on the most. Even if I have to pay the price of my official career, I will fight to get rid of him early." He did not reveal his thoughts completely. Xueqi was different from the Yi and Qin families. This person did not have a cooperative relationship with the eldest princess. Rather, he had a loyal relationship. In the end, he would become an obstacle on Fan Xian's path. Fan Xian was not like the Qing emperor, who had that kind of abnormal self-confidence. Thus, he always had a strange feeling toward Xueqi's arrows. He always felt his heart palpitate. Before the big explosion came, if he could destroy this divine bow of the Qing kingdom's north, Fan Xian felt that his life would be much happier. Killing Xueqi's son would only make that peerless expert go crazy, and killing this peerless expert would most likely make the eldest princess go crazy. Fan Xian liked this kind of unusually exciting and risky attempt. Even if this matter could bring about many variables and could cause the emperor's will to shift in an instant, he still wanted to try it like crazy. He wanted to wipe away the shadow of the arrow in his heart. Yan Bingyun looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at a madman. A moment later he sighed and said, "Governor Yan's cultivation is astonishing. How could he be so easy to kill? Even in the entire council, there is no way to find someone who can defeat him. Even if you weren't injured, you wouldn't be able to kill him with your sword, much less now that you are injured." Also, presumably, the director did not make such crazy arrangements.
"No," Fan Xian shook his head.
"The old cripple is probably even crazier than me. I don't want to be driven to death by his madness. If I want to protect my life, I also have to be a bit crazier. Other than the two of you, I don't want anyone else to know what I'm thinking." Fan Xian patted Xija's shoulder and stared at Yan Bingyun. "The words we said in the hills outside Jingdo in the past still count.
If you want to follow me and create a large situation, sometimes, I hope you can be more attentive to me and not just to the Overwatch Council and court."
Yan Bingyun knew he was talking about the path of powerful officials and the joy of the world. He sighed. Worry appeared between his brows and he went downstairs. Pushing open the window on the 3rd floor of Baoyue brothel that faced the street, Fan Xian and his brother looked at the snowy scene on the street through the railing and were speechless for a long time. Snowflakes slowly floated down from the sky and gently landed on people's hats, shoulders, umbrellas, and the roofs of carriages. Jingdo was solemn and was mainly dark. Particularly, the street in front of Baoyue brothel was filled with black carriages of the Overwatch Council. Inside and outside the carriages were Overwatch Council officials in deep black rainproof lotus robes. It looked even darker. Fortunately, there was endless snow that slightly removed the darkness. Pure white snowflakes adorned the completely black world and formed a clear and beautiful picture. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked down. Wang Qinian and his group had left. Deng Ziyu had left. Yan Bingyun, who was the last to leave the building, had also left. The Overwatch Council officials and secret agents on the street had disappeared without a trace in an instant. He couldn't resist smiling slightly. Presently, his subordinates all had at least a dozen capable people by their side.
In court and officialdom, who dared to be disrespectful to these trusted aides of Sir Fan Jr.?
These capable trusted aides had also helped Fan Xian lay out an even larger power net, making Fan Xian's position in the Qing kingdom even more stable and high. The so-called system was stacked layer by layer like this.
However, the glory today was not something that the young man who had just entered Jingdo and muddle-headedly formed the Qinian unit could have imagined.
"Don't tell father what I said today." Fan Xian tilted his head and glanced at his brother. Warmly he said, "I don't want him to worry about us juniors." Fan Xija made a sound of acknowledgement and chuckled. "Brother, it's useless even if you say it. Father is good at managing the national treasury, but when it comes to killing people, he can't help you much. He's nowhere near as powerful as your Overwatch Council." Fan Xian smiled. The 80 tiger guards the royal family usually used as guards could be said to be the most powerful martial force other than the imperial army guards. Even if not all of them were as powerful as Gouda, who used a knife, 7 tiger guards could defeat Begonia Duo. How terrifying were these 80? Their serious and honest father had secretly trained so many aces for the royal family.
Given Fan Xian's understanding of his father's temperament, it was impossible that he didn't keep some powerful people for himself in the Fan manor. Such a minister of revenue had long left the power of a minister. Killing people? Fan Xian looked at his brother and shook his head. He didn't say anything. Thinking back to the time when the Emperor and the Empress Dowager's own brother had been beheaded by our father with one strike. Who dared to say he didn't know how to kill people? However, his father was used to enduring silently. He was used to calmly staying out of things and watching them happen, so not many people knew of his ruthlessness. Only old foxes like Chen Pingping and Prime Minister Lin knew the true power of this Minister of Revenue. However, Fan Xian did not want his father to suddenly change his way of doing things because of his own matters. Did you see Ruoruo in Shangjing? Fan Xian lightly changed the topic. It was better to let his father maintain that serious and pedantic image in his brother's heart. However, ever since Ruoruo had learned from Ku He, there had only been some letters sent to Jiangnan. Afterward, there had been no news of her. Although Fan Xian knew very well that nothing had happened to his sister through Haitong's relationship with the Northern Qi Emperor, the brother-sister relationship was deep. He would always miss her. I've seen her a few times, Fan Xizha said with a smile. She is studying medicine with Imperial Advisor Ku He and has some fame in Shangjing. However, I heard that she went to Shi Mountain to gather herbs in the second half of the year. She is cultivating in the mountains and hasn't come back. Fan Xian laughed coldly and scolded. Ku He, that old bald donkey, is truly shameless to the extreme. In the original agreement, I didn't give them anything less. Yet it's just to teach Ruoruo medicine? Does she need to learn medicine from him? With me or Sir Fei? Which one isn't better than him? He just doesn't want to pass on the heart of Tianyi Dao to my sister. Yet he's found all these excuses. He spoke angrily, but Fan Xizha listened to him with shock. Although this kid was also a troublemaker who feared nothing but his brother's big feet, he had lived in Northern Qi for a long time. He had long been infected by the Northern Qi people's godlike reverence for Imperial Advisor Ku He. Hearing his brother repeatedly call him a bald donkey, although he didn't know what the allusion was to bald donkey, presumably, it was an ugly thing to hear. He couldn't help but feel a bit scared. He thought to himself that his brother was indeed the most daring and confident person in the world. Although Ku He had been secretive, the exchange of students this time had been an accessory to the escape marriage. Fan Xian did not expect his sister to be taught by Ku He to become a second Begonia Duo. Additionally, the supreme heart of Tianyi Dao had long been secretly given to Fan Xian by Duo, who had turned to outsiders. He no longer verbally humiliated the untrustworthy Northern Qi higher-ups. Instead, he furrowed his brows and said, I've checked the files for the aces you recruited in Northern Qi. Although their backgrounds are clean and they have always been hidden in the wilderness, you have to be careful. I think the Northern Qi royal family must have placed a few spies at your side. The so-called clean backgrounds referred to the Northern Qi aces with curved knives at Fan Xizha's side. They did not have any official or brocade guard backgrounds. Fan Xizha nodded. Although he still had a smile on his face, a cold light flashed through his eyes. Don't worry, big brother. I've already found out who it is. If the Northern Qi court doesn't send people at my side, they will certainly not be at ease. Thus, I still have to use these people. They can be free bodyguards. They won't be sent out in a short time. However, I will avoid those important matters. Fan Xian was surprised. He hadn't expected his brother to have noticed these details. He couldn't help but pat his brother's back in praise. Your bones are strong, and your thoughts are much more detailed. It seems that being banished to the north has indeed improved. He immediately smiled and said, There's no need to worry too much. Right now, Northern Qi is still counting on a young merchant like you to buy palace treasury goods for them. They won't easily offend you. The Baoyue brothel was already empty. Even the ruffians standing at the corners of the alleys had pulled on their hats and disappeared without a trace. Fan Xian stood by the railing and watched this scene. A strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. All the powers in Jingdo had their eyes on the Baoyue brothel, but he was too lazy to avoid anything. Everyone knew he would retaliate, and they were all guessing how he would retaliate without any concrete evidence. He would let people guess. There is something you need to tell me in detail. Fan Xian's eyes were still staring at the snowflakes outside the window. He didn't turn his head back as he asked quietly. Fan Xizha asked curiously, What is it? The story of that sword.
Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. His tone was calm. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking. Where did Wang Qinian get this sword? Fan Xija's heart trembled. He didn't understand why his brother would have doubts about his most trusted aide, but he didn't dare say anything. He only repeated the story he had learned in Shangjing. The taking of the sword, the purchase of the sword, and the delivery of the sword were all arranged by Wang Qinian. There was nothing strange. However, Fan Xian sensed something fishy in this story. He smiled bitterly and lowered his head to glance at his waist. There was nothing there.
The emperor's sword that the emperor had given him was not convenient to carry around.
Listening to you, there is a very interesting detail. He shook his head and sighed. The news has been out for so many days. Even if Wang Qinian had your silver to help him, it would still be impossible for him, a Qing person, to buy this sword. Although tens of thousands of liang of silver is a lot, it can't compare to the hot-bloodedness of the northern Qi people. This is the sword of the Wei Emperor. How could the northern Qi royal family let him buy it? Lao Wang has been stable all his life. It's just that he likes to flatter me too much. Why didn't he think of this?
Fan Xija's eyes spun a few times and said curiously, "Brother, you mean to say, this sword was purposely released by the northern Qi royal family and was given to you through Sir Wang's hands?"
Fan Xian nodded.
Fan Xija didn't understand and said, "Why is that?"
Fan Xian turned around and patted his brother's shoulder. The two brothers sat back at the table and drank a few mouthfuls of tea before he explained, using the sword to separate people. Although it won't be of much use right now, and Northern Qi wouldn't want me to lose my position in the Qing kingdom right now, this is a kind of attitude and foreshadowing. Accumulating over time, one day, it will reach a critical point, he mockingly said. The little emperor of Northern Qi is not simple. In these 2 years, he has quietly taken power step by step from his mother's hands. He has yet to cause any major tremors in the Northern Qi court.
This kind of monarchical scheming is not much less than that of our emperor.
To deal with someone like me, of course, he has a long-term plan in his heart. This sword is only the beginning. Sowing dissension had always been a small path in history, but it was also a trick that had been tried and tested time and time again. Because people were often suspicious, the black veins on the surface of the emperor's heart were densely engraved with question marks and exclamation marks. The Wei Emperor's sword from Northern Qi was by Fan Xian's side a great taboo.
If he had not handled it appropriately and acted quickly to send the sword into the palace, who knew what the Qing emperor would feel in his heart?
Fan Xija clicked his tongue and sighed. Politics is indeed complicated.
Although my departure from Shangjing was secretive, before I left, the Northern Qi emperor summoned me into the palace and had me bring a message to you.
Presumably, he knew I would be making a trip back home.
Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked, "What message?"
Looks like it is not a normal color. The color depends on his ice and snow.
Fan Xija looked at his brother's handsome face and said enviously, "It's these 2 lines of poetry. It looks like the emperor's great love for the story of the stone is indeed not a lie.
Every time he enters the palace, he always brings the topic to you.
There is an indescribable love and respect."
Fan Xian laughed in spite of himself. These 2 lines were from a section in The Dream of the Red Chamber about the red plum blossoms. In itself, it could not be considered outstanding. However, the Northern Qi emperor had traveled thousands of li to give this poem to him. The hidden meaning was difficult to fathom. He turned his body to look at the wind and snow outside the window. Shaking his head, he smiled and said, "The Northern Kingdom has ice and snow. The Qing Kingdom also has ice and snow. Let's forget about this invitation." The conversation had come to an end. However, a faint worry welled up in Fan Xian's heart.
He didn't know why the Northern Qi emperor regarded him with such favor. He knew he was the illegitimate child of the Qing emperor, yet he still did not forget to incite a rebellion. Why did this seemingly impossible mission make the emperor talk about it so enthusiastically? Could the other party truly guess his thoughts, the story of the past, and the present situation and rush to stand at the city gates to welcome him with a smile? When Fan Xian returned to the manor, he couldn't avoid being scolded by his father again. Xija's safe return made Lady Lu overjoyed. Tears streamed down her face. Although Minister Fan was angry at his 2 sons' audacity and ordered Fan Xija not to leave the manor and had everyone in the manor keep quiet, the comfort between his brows could not be hidden from Fan Xian's eyes. After a while in Baoyue brothel, the Fan manor was immersed in a warm mood.
The Overwatch Council had already begun to move. Yan Bingyun coldly narrated the matter of the investigation into the attack in the valley at the council meeting. Although he did not have any specific suspects, he did not avoid pointing to the military. Thus, he requested that the entire council use its power to begin combing through the human traffic in Dingzhou and Songzhou over the past 2 months. This proposal was a bit strange. Without the emperor's explicit edict, the Overwatch Council had no power at all against the higher-ups in the military. Yan Bingyun's proposal seemed to be purely to make the seemingly peaceful life in Jingdou livelier. However, Sir Yan Jr. had the powerful support of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, as well as the help of a few elders. Additionally, all of the council officials and secret agents held a grudge against the attack in the valley, so they did not oppose it. Strangely, the palace also did not say anything. Wang Qinian returned to the Qinian unit. He did not immediately take over Deng Ziyu's position. His people and subordinates disappeared into Jingdou. No one knew what they were going to do. Only the first bureau, which Fan Xian still personally managed, was relatively lively. After a full year and a half of open action, the position of the first bureau yamen in Jingdou was no longer as awkward. The people of Jingdou had also gradually gotten used to seeing the notices on the wall outside the first bureau yamen. For example, yesterday, he had caught the corrupt official, and today, he had found a parasite in a certain department. After Fan Xian had cleaned up the first bureau, these kinds of shady and private matters of the court were openly posted. The people of Jingdou often read them like they were reading a legendary crime-solving novel. One day, the old notices on the wall were suddenly torn down. After washing them with snow water, the temporary head of the first bureau, Mu Tai, whose face was like black iron, personally brushed the paste and pasted a new piece of paper on the wall. The people gathered around curiously. They saw that it was not a case, it was just a few witty words. 13th Wang, are you hungry? If you are, tell the girl that the girls will make noodle soup for you.
The people looked at each other and thought, what is the Overwatch Council, or rather Sir Fan Jr., who had just been assassinated, playing at?
On the last day of the month, I spread my hands and asked for monthly votes. At the same time, I shook everyone's hands tightly. Next month's monthly votes are all mine. They are all mine. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 456. Many years later, when Wang Shi, the 13th disciple of the Sword Hut, stood in front of that group of riders, he would certainly think of that bright afternoon when Sangwon had taken him to choose a girl. He would feel the same helplessness and headache. At that time, Baoyue Brothel was already the #1 money-squandering establishment in the world. The courtyards were like the residences of the princes and dukes, distributed on the 2 sides of the thin lake behind the building. There was thin ice on the lake, and on the ice was snow. In the snow, there were countless dark red flower petals blown off the winter-sweet branches by the lake. Yes, it was like blood and snow, cold and incomparably hot, just like the thoughts of the young noble who wrote the notice. But this was more like a bowl of noodle soup. The white and tender wastes of noodles floated in the beautiful noodle soup. The dozen or so dried peppers that had been cut open with scissors were bright red, stimulating the diner's eyes, heart, mouth, and nose. Wang Shi took a deep breath, rubbed his nose, and shook his head with some sadness. He placed his chopsticks on the table twice, pierced through the broth, and picked up a chopstick of noodles. He ate carefully and elegantly. He ate very politely, but his speed was very fast. In a short while, there was only white broth left in the bowl. Without stopping, he picked up the bowl and drained it in one gulp. Sangwon, who had accompanied Deng Ziyu back to the capital from Suzhou to report on his orders, looked warmly at this fortune-teller. Although she didn't know why the official had made such an arrangement, she was certain that this fortune-teller was not an ordinary person. He was indeed extraordinary. He was very good-looking, with thin lips, sword-like eyebrows, and a pair of gentle and spirited eyes. There was a sense of tranquility about him, and even when he was drinking the noodle soup, he still looked very attractive. Sang Wanjiao had been a bystander for a long time in the romantic scene in the capital. She knew that eating noodle soup was the most uncultured aspect of a person.
Of course, she did not think that there was anything to look down on when those boorish men ate noodle soup 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 was as elegant as reciting poetry. Xueqi placed the bowl of noodles on the table, furrowed his brows and sighed. His brows, eyes and breathing were full of self-deprecation and helplessness. He turned to Sang Wen and looked at this woman who had a slightly broad jaw but looked exceptionally gentle. He said evenly, "Where is the girl you picked for me? Between the young lady and the broth, you can only choose one." For some reason, Sang Wen felt that the young man in front of her was very cute. She smiled and said, "Since you've chosen the noodles in the soup, you can forget about this girl." Xueqi said with a bitter face, "Even if it's a part-time job, you still have to get paid." Sang Wen calmly said, "You are not here to work for Darren." Xueqi suddenly quieted down. A moment later he said in a soft voice, "I've already drunk this noodle soup. I just don't understand. With Miss Sang's status, why would she personally make a bowl of noodle soup for me?" Sang Wen was slightly startled. She immediately smiled and said, "Director Chen likes the noodle soup I make." When Xueqi heard that person's name, he couldn't help but be startled. His countenance changed as he said, "This is my good fortune." Sang Wen bowed slightly and finally said, "I just want to let you know one thing. Although the broth is too hot and you can't drink it in a hurry, if you wait for the broth to turn cold, it won't taste good." The young lady didn't know what these words meant. She only followed Fan Xian's orders and lightly said this. Xueqi knew very well what these words meant. At the beginning, the agreement said that before he entered the capital, he had to bring the little archer's head to Fan Xian. Now, Fan Xian had been recovering in Jingdo for a long time, yet there had been no movement from him. Furthermore, there was the attack in the valley. The handsome young man sighed again with unspeakable sadness and sadness. With a flip of his hand, he picked up the green banner by the table and muttered, "But I really don't like killing people." Sang Wen didn't say anything more. She had no idea about the details of this matter. His meeting with this fortune-teller, who called himself Tai Xiang, was purely because Fan Xian wanted to borrow her eyes, which had seen many things, to see just what the other person's personality and character was like. Very true and very pure. This was all that Sang Wen saw from his eyes. Xueqi shook his head and sighed. Like an old man, he bent his body and walked out of the courtyard. When he reached the door, he suddenly tilted his head and asked with confusion, "Calling me here, are you not afraid that someone will suspect you?" "You are intelligent, that is why you came to find me," Sang Wen calmly said. "It is precisely because you are intelligent that you know how to avoid other people's eyes and ears." Xueqi shook his head again and left Baoyue brothel. Sang Wen returned to her room and sat quietly for a long time. The door to the courtyard was pushed open. A man came in with furrowed brows and asked, "When you just came back yesterday? Why have you come to this brothel again?" This man was none other than the protector Fan Xian had sent flying with one palm when he had visited Baoyue brothel that night. This Jianghu man was infatuated with Sang Wen, so he always had a sense of disgust toward Baoyue brothel. Sang Wen raised her eyes to look at him and smiled slightly. Although she was moved by this person's infatuation, she could not allow him to know all the details related to the commissioner. She smiled and said, "I am now the shopkeeper of Baoyue brothel. If I don't come here, where else would I go?" The man looked at the big bowl on the table and smelled the faint fragrance coming from inside. Involuntarily, his brows relaxed and he chuckled. "Make me a bowl to eat too. I haven't eaten in a long time." Sang Wen glared at him and said, "I don't have that kind of free time right now." The man said unhappily, "You make it for other people." Sang Wen said without good humor, "Do you think this bowl of noodles is that good? If you really eat it, you'll probably be so upset that you want to die." At this moment, Xueqi was so upset that he wanted to die. He sat in the shop by the city gate and stared at the bowl of noodles in a daze. His incomparably soft eyes were wide open. No matter how good the noodles were, if he ate 3 meals a day, it would always make him want to vomit. Thus, he didn't touch the bowl of noodles at all. He only drank the tea beside it, cup after cup, as if he was extremely thirsty. To the side, the tea bartender looked at this fortune-teller with cold and disdainful eyes. He thought to himself that of all the things this young man could do, he had to pretend to be a charlatan. Seeing how poor he was,
He could only use tea to go with the noodles. After drinking a bellyful of tea, the sun in Jingdo, where the wind and snow had already stopped, finally sank. Wang Shi picked up the green banner and coughed gently. He passed through the previously closed city gate and became the last person to leave the city today. 7 li north of the city, he stopped his steps at the top of a mountain and sat down on a large rock. Raising his head to glance at the snowy branches in the forest, he lowered his head to pick up a large handful of snowflakes and sent them into his mouth to chew. He then placed the green banner in the snow and looked at the military camp on the other side of the mountain in a daze. The Yuan Tai camp of the Jingdo garrison. Wang Shi suddenly tilted his head, opened his mouth, and vomited with a wah sound. This vomiting was endless. He vomited out all of the noodles and noodle soup he had eaten and the bellyful of tea he had gulped down. A clump of muddled and ugly paste was vomited onto the clean snowy ground. It looked unusually disgusting, particularly the faint fishy smell hidden in it. It made the nose want to cough. However, Wang Shi didn't vomit again. He only ate another clump of snow and then stared at the puddle on the ground. A moment later he sighed and said, "What a powerful medicine to be able to raise the Xueqi in a person's body to such a tyrannical realm in one day." He shook his head and sighed in admiration. This medicine had been placed in the noodle soup by Fan Xian through Sang Wen's hands. Presumably, Fan Xian wanted him to do it but also didn't want anything to happen to him. This medicine was the small yellow pill he had taken when he was fighting against Lang Tiao and Friar He, 2 9th-level aces, in northern Qi. Other than collapsing a little afterward, there weren't many side effects. Of course, Wang Shi had also sensed this. He still smiled bitterly and said, "Your honey is my arsenic. This medicine is poison to me. It almost killed me." However, Fan Xian would not be so kind as to help Wang Shi increase his chances of success. As for what he was planning, Wang Shi didn't quite understand. Night gradually fell. Wang Shi rose. Without another glance at the green banner beside him, he used the cover of the darkness to head toward the Jingdo garrison's Yuan Tai camp. The target he wanted to kill had been hiding in that camp the entire time. He was only using the identity of an officer, so the security around him was not very tight. However, Wang Shi truly did not like killing people. Ever since he left home, his hands had never been stained with blood. He pitied the people of the world and respected all life. Even under Fan Xian's powerful suppression, he had tried countless times and still could not truly assassinate someone he had no grudge against. This was why he had continued his pledge of allegiance to this day. In reality, the condiment Fan Xian added to the noodle soup was a stimulant. He wanted 13th Wang to be a little braver and more ruthless. However, he had not expected that this condiment would not be of much use to 13th Wang. On the contrary, it would harm him. Thus, 13th Wang remained calm and merciful. However, since he had not become crazy and knew that the most powerful aspect of an archer was their eyesight and that archery was most effective in the darkness, why did he still choose this time to strike? In a corner of the barracks in the Yuan Tai camp, Yan Xiaoyi's son, Yan Shendu, was carefully using a feather hinge to repair an arrow. His hands were incomparably steady. He repaired the long feathers attached to the tail of the arrow until they were unusually smooth. To do a good job, one must first sharpen their tools. He had a pair of hands that a godly archer should have, so he could repair his arrow to the fastest and most accurate. Governor Yan had always believed in one principle. Only children who were far away from their parents could truly have a future. It was just like how his parents had died at a young age and he had hunted in the mountains for a living. Only then could he cultivate such a cruel and ruthless will. Only then would he be noticed by the young eldest princess, who had come into the mountains to play, and be taken out of the mountains to join the ranks. With his skills, he had achieved countless military merits and obtained such a lofty position. When Yan Shendu was only 12, Yan Xiaoyi chased him out of the family and entrusted him to the eldest princess. The eldest princess knew the thoughts of her top general. Although she was gentle toward Yan Xiaoyi, she did not stop at sharpening him. After he had finished his skills, she had secretly sent him to the Jingdo garrison. The Jingdo garrison now controlled by the Qin family. Other than a few high-ranking generals and the eldest princess's trusted aides, no one knew that the son of the governor of the north, Yan Shendu, was an unremarkable officer in the Jingdo garrison. Yan Shendu was like his name. He did not like to communicate with other people. He only liked to communicate with arrows. Thus, He did not have many companions in the military. He only had a group of subordinates he had personally trained, subordinates loyal to the eldest princess. The day he ambushed the second priest of the temple, Great Master Sanshi, on the outskirts of Jingdo was Yan Shendu's first operation. He thought the operation was very successful because he did not know what happened later. Thus, the confidence that had long been suppressed in the depths of his heart surfaced. He thought that other than his father, no one would be able to stop his long-distance attack. Even a 9th-level ace could not. The length of a weapon's effective range determined life and death on the battlefield. This was a supreme principle that Xueqi had never forgotten to teach his son. Because of his confidence, he was arrogant and egotistical. When he heard that his father and the Jiangnan Road Imperial envoy Fan Xian had been summoned back to Jingdo at the same time and that the two sides were likely to fight in the martial conference that had stopped for many years, Yan Shendu could not sit still. He worshipped his father, but he actually had a glimmer of worship and jealousy hidden in his heart toward the brilliant and dazzling Sir Fan Jr. All the young people under heaven were like this, and Yan Shendu was no exception. Thus, he wanted to test just what kind of remarkable power Sir Fan Jr. had. On one hand, it was to test the other party's depths on behalf of his father. On the other hand, it was difficult to resist the temptation of being able to shoot down the world-famous Fan Xian. Regardless of whether it was for his father or the eldest princess, Fan Xian's death was, without question, a hard-to-suppress piece of honey. However, he did not act on his own because he was a soldier. He would not act on his own that would disrupt the overall situation. He had to wait for the orders of his elders. The elders had given the orders, but strangely, the person who had given the orders was the military elder who knew him very well and who he deeply respected. Yan Shendu was very confused, but he had no time to inform the eldest princess. He could only go on his way alone. He shot an arrow in the snowy night but was blocked by the green banner. After the matter, only in the night did he helplessly discover that Fan Xian's protection was watertight. He watched in the snow forest in secret and could not find any opportunity to take advantage of, particularly as the deadly black knights were always near the Overwatch Council carriages. At any moment, they could turn the entire mountain over. Only now did he realize that he had underestimated Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council. He didn't dare to act rashly, so he kept retreating. He only shot an ineffective arrow and kept retreating. He returned to Jingdo from the valley to the Qin Manor to report, but he was not reprimanded. Returning to the tent, he sank into deep thought. The elders in the military all looked out for each other in secret. His entry into the Jingdo garrison was something that the old Qin master had nodded to. Not many people knew about it. Why did the old Qin master want him to do something that appeared to be fooling around? Then, the news of the attack in the valley came. He was a soldier, so his sense of politics was not very sharp. However, he knew that his father seemed to have been dragged down by the old Qin master. In other words, the old Qin master had also been dragged down by the eldest princess. The elders had finally huddled together. He was like a hostage that the elders did not say anything to each other but showed their intentions clearly. Yan Shendu shook his head. He did not dislike this role-playing. He just thought that under such powerful pressure, Sir Fan Jr. shouldn't be able to live for many more days. He placed the small arrow in his right hand on the table and used his steady hands to stroke the arrow shaft. Narrowing his eyes, he measured it for a moment before nodding his head in satisfaction. Taking out the longbow at his side, he placed the slender and beautiful arrow on the string. Pulling the bow slightly, he aimed at the empty space in the barracks. His forearm moved slightly to the right. The tip of the arrow was pointed at the thick cotton curtain at the front door of the barracks. Yan Shendu's face was calm as he said, "Come out." The cotton curtain was slowly lifted. Wang Shi walked in with an apologetic expression. Under the threat of the longbow, he didn't take another step. He only stood at the door and sighed. "Sorry." Yan Shendu's pupils constricted slightly. He looked at the figure in front of him who was about the same age as him. His eyesight was startling. He had long recognized this person as the man with the green banner who had blocked his soul-stealing arrow in front of the Snowy Night family school. He knew that although his identity in the garrison was kept a secret and he didn't have many guards protecting him, for the other party to be able to pass through the layers of defenses of Yuantai camp and quietly get close to his barracks in the middle of the night, his skill was unusually high. If it had been Yan Shendu's usual habits, he would have shot the arrow on the bow long ago. For anyone who wanted to ambush him, Yan Shendu would make them lose their lives. Strangely, faced with this strange figure, Yen Shindu did not release the bowstring.
He only coldly said, "Who are you?"
Wang Shi slowly lowered his head and said apologetically, "I am 13th Wang. I have come under orders to kill you. It is not my wish. I am truly unwilling." Yen Shindu used the tip of the arrow to aim between the man's brows. His hands were steady. The bow did not tremble at all. It was as if he would not feel a sliver of fatigue, even if he pulled it for 10,000 years. The killing intent carried by the tip of the arrow was already reflected in the other party's mind. He didn't think there was anyone in the world who could escape this arrow of his. Hearing the other party admit he was here to kill him, not only did Yen Shindu not panic, on the contrary, a glimmer of coldness appeared.
"Fan Xian."
Wang Shi bowed and helplessly said, "Other than him, who else in this world can force me to kill?" The snow outside the barracks had long stopped. After nightfall, the sound of the wind rose again, whistling like the desperate cry of a wild beast in the mountains. It passed through the thick cotton curtains and crashed into people's eardrums. Yen Shindu looked at the person in front of him whose face was full of apology. A chill surged in his heart. Why was it that there was not a glimmer of nervousness or murderous intent on 13th Wang's face? Instead, there was endless sorrow and guilt. As an assassin, what did he need to feel guilty about? Guilt to kill him? Yen Shindu's state of mind was not in a mess, but he became cold. If the other party was not pretending to be mysterious, then he certainly had the ability to kill him. It was just like hunting beasts in the mountains. Faced with a child's arrow, a thick-skinned bear would steadily rub itself against the bark of a tree. It was extremely comfortable, because the bear knew that the arrow would not be able to kill it. Could this arrow of his kill 13th Wang in front of him? For the first time in his life, Yen Shindu had doubts about the arrow in his hand because the green banner had moved on that snowy night. "Can we talk?" Wang Shi sighed and licked his unusually dry lips. "I don't have to kill you. If you are willing to come with me and no longer participate in the matters of this world, destroy your martial arts, cut off all contact with the world, and let the world think you are dead, then Fan Xian will be appeased. His goal will be achieved, and I won't have to kill you." Yen Shindu didn't smile. He just felt it was very absurd. Thus he let go. The arrow was like a black line, flying out with a whoosh. One moment it seemed to be on Yen Shindu's bowstring. In the next moment, it was already in front of Wang Shi. Then, Yen Shindu saw a scene that shocked him greatly. He saw Wang Shi's feet move slightly. He took 3 consecutive steps. After 3 steps, he returned to where he had been standing. Where was that arrow? The arrow carrying an endless gust of wind brushed past Wang Shi's face and passed through the thick cotton curtain. With a whoosh, it shot into the endless darkness. It merged with the sound of the wind whistling in all directions and could no longer be heard. It looked like 3 simple steps, but Yen Shindu's pupils had already constricted. He saw the profoundness within. To be able to avoid his swift arrow at such a short distance required not only a terrifying reaction speed, but also a matching extremely high control of Xueqi. Who exactly was this person? Where did such an ace come from? Why would he risk his life for Fan Xian? 3 questions surged into Yen Xiaoyi's mind. However, his hands did not slow at all. He had already shot out 3 arrows that turned into 3 streaks of lightning and shot toward Wang Shi's upper, middle and lower body. He raised a small knife and flipped up. Slicing through the camp cloth behind him, he disappeared into the darkness. This series of actions and the 3 consecutive arrows had already used up too much of his energy. He didn't have the energy to call for help. Furthermore, he knew that even if the soldiers in the camp rushed over, they would not be able to save him in front of this mysterious fortune-teller. Behind the tent, Yen Shindu still held his bow, but he did not shoot. He looked at Wang Shi in front of him like he was looking at a ghost. He didn't know how Wang Shi had dodged those 3 arrows or how he had rushed ahead of him to block his path of retreat. Fortunately, Yen Shindu's eyes were sharp. He saw the fresh blood dripping down Wang Shi's sleeve. Wang Shi was injured. This reality made Yen Shindu's spirit rise. The seemingly profound footwork could not completely dodge the Yen family's divine arrows. The sky had not yet snowed. The wind whistled past, sweeping up the remaining snow on the ground. It was no different from falling snow. Wang Shi lowered his head and glanced at his blood-soaked sleeve. He shook his head and said, "I truly don't want to kill." "Then why did you come?" Yen Shindu narrowed his eyes and asked coldly. "Because Wang Shi gazed at the night sky above his head with some confusion.
Because I have to help Fan Xian for the peace of the world, for the balance of the entire land, for my home, or for something else?
I have to help him. The peace of the world rests on one person's body? Fan Xian is not the emperor. Yan Shendu retreated to the left and bent back slightly. He placed the arrow against his quiver.
As he spoke, he silently prepared.
There is no one left in my family, Wang Shi sighed.
For the peace of the world I have to help him, so I can only let you down. But in every great era, there is always a need for the sacrifice of minor figures.
Minor figure? Yan Shendu had never seen him like this.
He was the son of the governor, the successor of the Yan family's archery skills, and an influential figure in the future.
Right now, he had only killed the second priest of the temple. His glory had not been completely released, so how could he die? Wang Shi once again raised his head to gaze at the sky. It was as if he wanted to see through the thick clouds to the starry sky. Faintly he said, I hope I didn't help the wrong person.
Raising his head to gaze at the sky, how could he let such a good opportunity slip by?
Yan Shendu straightened his body, controlled the bowstring, and shot out 7 arrows in a row.
Then with one hand, he reached for the quiver and pulled out the last arrow.
Knocking it, and shooting. 7 arrows were in front, but the arrow with the strongest killing intent was hidden at the end. Yan Shendu had never been as satisfied with his cultivation as he was today.
To be able to shoot out such a number of 7 to 1 was already the peak of what he could achieve in his life.
He was even a bit more valiant than his father had been in the past. With such a terrifying arrow attack, he believed that even if it was Fan Xian standing opposite him, Fan Xian would not be able to dodge it. However, he forgot one thing. Everyone's way of fighting was different. If Fan Xian wanted to personally kill him, he would certainly be very sinister. He would poison him again and again and stab him again and again. He would not give him any chance to shoot out an arrow. If it was Fan Xian who came to kill him, Yan Shendu would certainly not be able to keep his body intact. He would die a stupid and ugly death. 13th Wang appeared to be gentle and kind, but the way he chose to fight was completely different from his appearance. It was brave and terrifying. Yes, it was terrifying. Wang Shi directly pounced over, like a large bird soaring in the dark night. He spread his wings, and a strong gust of wind blew. He ignored the 7 arrows piercing his body, and his eyes shone with a keen light. His right hand reached out, and he directly caught the last terrifying arrow. With a number of puffs, the arrows pierced through Wang Shi's body. However, his body was moving through the air and did not harm any vital parts. They only passed through his shoulder and lower arm. With a ripping sound, the last arrow slid out of Wang Shi's right hand like a wheel bearing heavy weight on a rough road, carrying with it an unpleasant grinding sound. A faint burning smell seemed to rise in the night sky. Wang Shi's right hand was burned by the lightning-like speed of the arrow. What kind of speed did this kind of high temperature mean? However, the arrow finally stopped just before it was about to pierce into Wang Shi's eye socket. It was only an inch. Just like this, he used a hand made of flesh and blood to hold on to this arrow. He had already swept in front of Yan Shendu like a bird. He was only a foot away. Wang Shi gave a muffled grunt and flipped his wrist, thrusting the tip of the arrow into Yan Shendu's heart. His hand moved like lightning and was unavoidable. Yan Shendu staggered and fell. Looking at the blood and arrow in his chest and the assassin covered in blood in front of him, he opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. Just like this, he sat in front of his barracks. His body twitched weakly a few times. He had forgotten what his father had once taught him. As an archer, the effective distance of a weapon determined life and death. He was still too close to the person in front of him. Wang Shi panted as he stood in front of him. Looking at the archer's gradually weakening breathing, he said, "Little archer, don't worry and go on your way." It was not until the moment of his death that Yan Shendu finally understood that he was truly just a minor figure in this great age. However, for someone skilled in archery to die under his own arrow, was that not a good end? However, he was not satisfied. He futilely circulated all the strength in his body and stretched forward. He wanted to catch this assassin and kill him. He wanted to kill the impending death. The tip of his finger touched Wang Shi's belt. There was a patch of ice-cold blood at the tentacle. He hooked onto something. Little archer Yan Shendu finally ran out of strength. With a gurgling sound in his throat, His head tilted to the side and he died. Wang Shi straightened his body and released his right hand.
He looked at the long and terrifying scorch mark in his palm and lowered his head to look at the 7 arrows stuck in his body. He looked at the blood all over his body and couldn't resist the pain. In a trembling voice he said to himself, "It hurts so much." He endured the pain and used the night snow and wind to escape Yuantai camp. Returning to the top of the mountain, he picked up the green banner and once again disappeared into the night. He was silent for a moment. He then shook his head and sighed. 13th Wang, a brave warrior but also an idiot. This month, the monthly votes rankings are filled with blood and foul wind. My position as the 1000-year number 5. Urgently asking for monthly votes. It's still the same old saying. I can't guarantee that there will be many updates. I just sincerely ask for monthly votes. I've always wanted to post a separate chapter to get votes. Look, scratch my head again. I don't want to become 13th Wang. Everyone, if you have monthly votes, fly over. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 457. The meaning of washing one's hands and making soup is very simple. The bride enters the kitchen for 3 days. Washing one's hands and making soup. A change in one's role in life. The first time holding hands, kissing, making love, killing. 13th Wang's first time. P.S. There were too many mistakes and missing words in yesterday's chapter. I plead guilty and will change. Also, today's monthly votes rankings are gloomy and murderous. It is truly like the mountains are angry, and the sunset is like blood. Beside me is Deng Shicheng. Ahem, it's canvassing votes. Use all your strength to canvass monthly votes. The second day was the day before the third. This was not nonsense because Warner was returning to the capital on the third day. Fan Xian was used to keeping his wife and family far away from all filthy matters, so he set the time for the second day. The wind was gentle and the sun was bright. The accumulated snow gradually melted. Tianhe Street was drenched. The flowing stone pools by the side of the street, which had accumulated snow, finally began to flow. Carrying the snow and dried leaves, it moved toward the low-lying areas. The 4 city gates in and out of Jingdo were guarded by the 13 city gate guards. These 13 city gate guards were directly transferred from the palace. Not to mention the fact that the Jingdo garrison could not extend their hands in. Even the military elders of the Bureau of Military Affairs would not do much on the surface. Every night, the Jingdo city gates would be closed. In the history of the Qing kingdom, other than a few bloody coups, as well as a few reports of natural disasters and turmoil on the borders, there had never been a precedent of opening the gates at night. The old director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping, was an exception. He lived in the Chen Garden outside the capital. The emperor had given this director special permission to enter the capital at night. However, there was only one exception. Other than Chen Pingping, no one could enter and leave Jingdo at night without imperial orders. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, this exception had one more person. Thus, even though the Jingdo garrison Yuantai camp found Yan Shendu's body and reported it step by step until it finally reached the general who knew Yan Shendu's true identity, the general in the camp, in his shock and fear, still had no way of informing the people in Jingdo. The commander of the Jingdo garrison, Qin Hang, only learned of this news the next morning. Then, the northern governor, Yan Xueqi, who had returned to the capital to debrief, also learned of this news. His own son had been assassinated in the camp last night. Yan Xueqi sat on the side of the bed with his legs wide open. This was a habit he had developed from many years of riding a horse in the army. His eyes were somewhat indifferent as he looked at the messenger kneeling in front of the door. He tilted his head slightly, not daring to believe his ears. Master! The 2 concubines on the bed suppressed the fear and uneasiness in their hearts and struggled to get up. They helped Governor Yan put on his clothes and got some water to wash up. Throughout all of this, Yan Xueqi maintained a kind of indifferent calmness. His hands that were rubbing in the hot water did not tremble in the slightest. Ever since he was a child, he had been exceptionally energetic. After enlisting in the army, he could not sleep without a woman. He had countless concubines at home. Even though he did not have a proper wife in his manor in the capital, He still had 5 concubines to serve him.
Last night, under the wind and rain, these 2 concubines could not bear it any longer. Xueqi tilted his head and glanced at the concubines beside him. In the past, he was used to secretly being proud of his physical strength and energy. But today, there was something strange in his heart. He felt a trace of loathing for these coquettish women. He had many women, but only one son. Calmly he stood up, tied a black gold and jade belt around his waist, put on a snow-blocking cloak, and walked out the door. Outside the door, there were already soldiers and terrified generals of the Jingdo garrison waiting.
Looking at the longbow and quiver of arrows held by his trusted aide, Xueqi was a little absent-minded beside his horse.
Even so, from the moment he heard the news until now, his expression was still calm.
There was not a hint of abnormality on his slightly dark face that carried a determined expression.
The sound of horse hooves gradually left the Yen manor. Inside the manor, 2 beautiful concubines had died tragically on the bed. Fresh blood dyed the entire green curtain. Under the protection of the soldiers, Governor Yen left the city gates and came to the Yuantai tent not far away. His expression was indifferent. He did not even glance at the commander of the camp who had come to comfort him. He even ignored Qin Hang, who had hurried over. He went directly into the central military tent. Yen Shindu's body was placed in the tent. No one dared to touch the body because everyone was waiting for Governor Yen to personally come and take a look. Xueqi stood in front of his son's body and didn't speak for a long time. He only furrowed his brows slightly. After a long time, his gaze lowered slightly and he stretched out his hand to pry open his son's already stiff hand. The dead person's grip was very tight. Xueqi pulled very hard and forcefully broke 2 of his son's fingers. He took something out of his son's palm and then raised it to his eyes to look at it closely. The light from outside the tent seeped in and gently snapped off the jade pendant. It shot into Xueqi's eyes and made his pupils constrict slightly. He recognized this jade pendant. There was a small sword on the jade pendant and a few words carved on the other side. Particularly that day in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Fan Xian had waved the horsewhip at him. It made this hidden resistance become a conflict that was about to explode. Thus, everyone would immediately think of Yen Shindu's death to Fan Xian. It wasn't Fan Xian, Xueqi said coldly. But, it must have something to do with Fan Xian. The city gates were right in front of them.
The personal attendant with the arrow glanced worriedly at the governor, thinking, if it truly had something to do with Sir Fan Jr., what would the governor do?
Would he kill the emperor's illegitimate child with 1 arrow in Jingdo? Xueqi narrowed his eyes slightly and didn't say anything. He only coughed and then covered his mouth. A trickle of blood seeped out from between his fingers. Last night's assassination did not spread. Not many people knew that Xueqi's son was in the Jingdo garrison. Secondly, the time was too short. Even the Overwatch Council headquarters did not know the relevant details. The civil and military officials of the Qing court belonged to 2 different systems. Naturally, not many officials in court knew about this matter. It was a minor court conference. The officials at the palace gates were gathered in 2s and 3s, each with their own mountain. However, the relationship between the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace and the Second Prince had eased a great deal, so the 2 factions of civil officials did not stand too far apart. The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was saying something in a low voice to the 2 scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. No one came close to the 3 of them. With the crack of a whip, the palace gates slowly opened. The commander of the Imperial Army, the Great Prince, walked out with a calm expression and bowed to the leaders at the front. Everyone quickly returned the bow. Ever since His Majesty had put the eldest prince in charge of the palace's security more than a year ago, the defense of the entire palace was indeed impregnable. The eldest prince was also a diligent person. Every time there was a court meeting, he would personally be on duty. He did not make any mistakes despite his status as a member of the royal family. Because of this, the officials who came to court all felt a glimmer of respect and fear toward the great prince. The officials filed in and went to court to discuss the gossip of the world with the Qing emperor. The palace gates immediately quieted down again. The snow on the square in front of the palace had long been swept clean, revealing the wet stones below. The snow that had been swept away formed a pile of snow about half a person's height on the other side of the square, like a low city. A carriage came from behind the long pile of snow. The carriage, the horse, and the driver were all black.
The imperial soldiers guarding the palace gates and the guards inside immediately knew the identity of the person in the carriage.
They couldn't help feeling curious and excited. The great prince pressed his hand on his sword and personally went forward to welcome them. He helped the young official, who still had difficulty moving, down from the carriage.
The two of them spoke quietly all the way into the palace.
The soldiers inside and outside the palace gates did not dare to breathe too loudly. They only carefully watched this scene from the corner of their eyes.
It was not until the figures of the great prince and the young official disappeared into the royal palace that everyone let out a breath and excitedly began to discuss in low voices.
Did you see that? Everyone says the great prince has a good relationship with him. It looks like it is not false. What's so strange about that? They are brothers.
Brothers.
Someone laughed coldly. Don't you remember how Commissioner Fan dealt with the second prince a year ago?
Silence.
Although the people of the Qing kingdom were open-minded and there were rarely cases of people being punished for their words, they were talking about the royal family without restraint in front of the Palace of Brilliance.
It had to be said that these soldiers, who had once followed the great prince to the west to fight the barbarians and later returned to the imperial army to stand guard, were indeed very daring. The two eunuchs looked at these imperial soldiers like they were looking at immortals.
Is that the legendary Sir Fan Jr.?
A guard, who had clearly not been in the palace for long, said with an excited expression.
It is indeed as the legends say. He is as handsome as a god. However, his complexion does not seem to be very good.
Nonsense.
He was assassinated a few days ago and suffered such heavy injuries. How could he have recovered? Speaking of which, it's strange. Sir Fan Jr.'s injuries healed very quickly. He can actually get off the ground and walk now. Why is he in such a rush to come to court? Don't forget, Sir Fan Jr. is the youngest 9th-level ace in the Qing kingdom. But speaking of assassination, everyone immediately fell silent. They knew that this matter was too terrifying. It was best to talk less about it. Fan Xian and the great prince walked through the palace. They didn't know what the people behind them were talking about.
However, the great prince couldn't help but be curious. Why was he in such a rush to enter the palace when his injuries had not healed? Why are you in such a rush to enter the palace?
Recently, the palace has been a bit chaotic. In order to investigate the matter of you being assassinated, everyone is nervous. Fan Xian smiled and said, Forgot? I remember that I sent the invitation to the manor.
It should have been personally received by the great princess.
Tonight, I'll treat at Baoyue brothel. I have the strength to treat, but I don't hurry into the palace to report. I'm afraid the emperor will spank me. You should call her great imperial concubine or sister-in-law. Why are you still calling her great princess? Forget it. The great imperial concubine sounds awkward. It always reminds me of Yi Ling. Sister-in-law is even less appropriate. I don't want to be scolded in front of my face by an official of Taichung Temple. My surname is Fan, but yours is Li. Fan Xian's words were a bit wild. At least, as an official speaking to the great prince, it appeared a bit unruly. The great prince knew what he was thinking and smiled helplessly.
Suddenly, he said solemnly, Do you know about that matter?
What matter? Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Yan Xiaoyi's son was assassinated last night. The great prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes as if trying to determine from them whether or not this assassination had anything to do with him. Fan Xian raised his brows and couldn't be bothered to pretend to be surprised. If he's dead, then he's dead. In any case, he's not one of my people. Stop guessing. This matter has nothing to do with me.
The great prince looked at him and shook his head.
Regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with you, this matter will probably be remembered on your head. So be it, Fan Xian smiled warmly. I have many enemies in this life. I don't care if there's one or two more.
That person is
Yan Xiaoyi, the great prince reminded him in a serious tone. Fan Xian didn't reply.
He only thought to himself that the great prince beside him indeed had some power in the military.
At this moment, the city gates had probably just opened, yet he already knew the story of what had happened in Yuantai camp.
The great prince saw that he was ignoring him and furrowed his brows.
I'm afraid this matter will not be resolved so easily. Think about it. An assassin managed to sneak into the camp of the garrison near Jingdo. Once the matter is exposed, no one can think about having good days. This matter,
was done too impudently. Fan Xian heard the hidden meaning in his words and couldn't resist smiling coldly.
Yuan Tai Camp?
A few days ago, someone dared to move the military city guarding crossbows to kill an imperial envoy in the valley.
Just who is more impudent?
The great prince saw that he was angry, and knew that he had lost a number of subordinates in the attack in the valley. He could only change the topic and ask, "When is Chen girl coming back? Grandmother and my mother have missed her for who knows how long. I'm afraid they won't be willing to let her go to Jiangnan next year."
Fan Xian said, "She'll be back tomorrow."
"Oh right, I've also brought back the princess of the Hu tribe.
Additionally, I've bought a house in Yongtsong Alley. The place is remote and quiet. It's perfect to hide a mistress."
The great prince heard these words and hesitantly asked, "What mistress?"
Fan Xian took out a deed to the house and threw it to him.
The corners of his mouth twitched slightly.
"I'll give you a mistress."
The great prince didn't know what to say. He glared at him angrily and said, "In front of others, you have the graceful and elegant face of an immortal poet. Who knew that you have a sharp and unkind mouth of a fox?"
"That is true," Fan Xian said proudly.
Fan Xian proudly said, "I already have enough of a reputation. Next, I'm going to tear off all pretenses and have a good time with everyone."
The great prince was slightly shocked.
He furrowed his brows and said, "You invited so many people tonight.
What exactly do you want to do?
Don't mess around."
"How could I?
They are all descendants of nobility.
I can't wait to curry favor with them."
Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "However, I know what you're thinking. If you don't want your brothers to fight, it's simple.
Quickly defeat them."
The great prince disagreed and said, "These words are hard to hear. We are all of the same father. Just quietly wait for the divine judgment. You should know your limits."
"Don't mind."
Fan Xian shook his head.
"It's still that old saying.
My surname is Fan. But, don't worry, I don't have a hobby of chopping off my own fingers. As long as they are willing to behave after tonight, I won't do anything." The great prince smiled. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then couldn't resist laughing self-mockingly. Speaking of which, from ancient times until now, it could be seen in the history books that very few young officials dared to threaten the crown prince and princes like he did.
Furthermore, he had used such a lecturing tone. This matter appeared somewhat absurd. Fan Xian insisted that his surname was Fan.
He knew that if it wasn't for the fact that his surname should have been Li, he would not have the power to negotiate with the members of the royal family.
He wouldn't even have the right to do so. Based on his style of doing things, he would probably have died a long time ago.
Thus, when he waited for a long time in the royal study and finally saw the emperor surnamed Li lift the curtains and enter, his behavior could be considered respectful.
However, a glimmer of coldness and stubbornness occasionally appeared between his brows. As the saying goes, acting along the way was the same from beginning to end. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 458.
The inside of the royal study was much warmer than the outside. Silver bamboo charcoal from Langyizu burned in 3 fire basins. The intricately designed fire basins did not overflow with ash, only overflowing warmth. It enveloped the entire room in an atmosphere of spring that did not match the season. There was only a faint burning smell. The smell was not unpleasant, but Fan Xian's sensitive nose was not used to it. He couldn't help but miss the warm smell of a white room in a distant world. He thought of 2 witty sayings he had once read in his previous life. The emperor has never used a cell phone, and the emperor has never had air conditioning. The emperor minded his own business and sat down on the couch. From his expression, it could be seen that he was very satisfied with the warmth of the royal study. The silver hair at his temples and the slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes had all smoothed out.
On the couch, he took off the dragon robe he was wearing.
A young eunuch had long since brought him cotton clothes and brought over a bowl of warm bird's nest.
Fan Xian stood quietly to the side, but his gaze couldn't resist sneaking a curious glance.
There was indeed nothing strange about the daily life of a supreme being. The emperor was drinking when he saw Fan Xian's sneaky appearance out of the corner of his eye.
He couldn't resist laughing and scolded, "Is there nothing good to eat in Jiangnan? You're so greedy."
Fan Xian chuckled and said, The main thing is that I had to enter the palace early today, so I just randomly grabbed a few bites for breakfast. The emperor waved his hand and indicated for him to sit down. Eunuch Yao had been waiting for this edict at the side. He quickly went behind the curtain to bring out a round embroidered stool. Fan Xian sat down and couldn't help but think of a year and a half ago when he first entered the royal study to discuss matters. He was also curious as to why the emperor had not continued the meeting in the royal study after the court conference had ended. Instead, he had summoned him alone. Having not seen the emperor for over a year and thinking about such things as acting, Fan Xian didn't know what to say for a moment. Fortunately, when monarchs and officials met, it was the emperor who should speak first. The royal study immediately sank into silence again. The emperor placed the half-drunk bird's nest on the table and raised his head to look at Fan Xian's face. Looking at that delicate and warm face, for some reason, his heart, which had been cold for 20 years, moved. He couldn't resist slowly shaking his head, wanting to remove that glimmer of emotion from the emperor's head.
"How are your injuries?" the emperor asked as indifferently as possible. Fan Xian bowed slightly and replied respectfully, "Thank you for your concern, Your Majesty. I am fine."
He knew that the emperor already knew of the news of Yan Xiaoyi's son's unnatural death, but since the emperor did not mention it and did not connect this matter to him, he was happy to pretend to be mute and was too lazy to make any more excuses.
"Your Majesty?" The emperor repeated this in his heart, sighed, and smiled. "There is no need to be so reserved. If there is anything you want to say it. Before the new year, I banished you to Jiangnan because Zhan wanted to sharpen you and promote you, but it was too hard on you."
It was not easy for the emperor to say such gentle words.
Fan Xian's heart moved slightly, but he did not soften. Evenly he said, "To be honest, Your Majesty, this trip to Jiangnan, I am very willing." He continued with a smile, "The scenery in Jiangnan is beautiful. I've always wanted to go there."
He didn't refer to himself as his subject, but as I. Every time the conversation between the two of them developed in such a way. First, it went from ruler and subject, then to old and young, and finally to father and son. They never said it out loud, but both of them were well aware of it. It was warm, sour, and shameless. The emperor smiled. A moment later, he quietly said, "You have done very well in Jiangnan. I am very gratified." Naturally, he was talking about the matter of the palace treasury, the Jiaozhou matter, and the Jiangnan road matter. Fan Xian had demonstrated the demeanor and boldness that a young official should have in all of these matters. For this court, for this emperor, he had reaped many benefits from the people and the military.
Presently, Fan Xian was a knife in the emperor's hand. He had basically offended all of the powerful classes in court. The emperor also understood this. Thinking of the attack in the valley, he couldn't help but feel a faint sense of pity for Fan Xian, only, not much. After talking briefly about the matters in Jiangnan, the report on political affairs came to an end. After all, the main purpose of returning to court to report on his work was still in court. In a few days, Fan Xian would wear official robes and go to court with a special edict to receive the praise or criticism of all the civil and military officials in the court. Today, in the royal study, it was nothing more than a heart-to-heart talk between an emperor and a close official. Particularly regarding the Jiangnan and Jiaozhou matters, they had long been passed on to the emperor through endless secret memorials. The discussion today was elsewhere. The other place was Danzhou. The emperor seemed to be particularly interested in Fan Xian's trip to Danzhou to visit his relatives and asked in detail. Although Fan Xian felt it was strange, he patiently explained everything. He didn't even leave out the matter of Donger. Who knew how many spies the emperor had by his side? The emperor also asked about how the wet nurse in Danzhou was doing. Fan Xian answered each of them and described the present scene of Danzhou, the white seagulls, and the precipitous cliff beside the city. Then, Fan Xian fell silent because he discovered with some surprise that the emperor seemed to be lost in thought. The emperor's eyelids were slightly lowered. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes showed the unique charm of a middle-aged man. He didn't look at Fan Xian and didn't speak. He only calmly followed Fan Xian's narration as he recalled everything in Danzhou. Suddenly, he realized that the storytelling voice had stopped. The emperor raised his head in a daze and found Fan Xian was looking at him with concern. He couldn't help but smile and say, "It's nothing. I was just thinking that after returning from the last Western expedition, I haven't left Jingdo again. I can't help but miss the scenery of Danzhou. During the last Western expedition, there had been changes in Jingdo. Taiping Courtyard had been massacred. Fan Xian was carried by Wu Zhu and sat in the carriage with the black cloth to Danzhou. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He only hesitantly asked, "Your Majesty, have you also been to Danzhou?" "Of course I have."
The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly and he smiled slightly.
"When I went to Danzhou, you hadn't been born yet. It was there that I met your mother." Ruler and official were both silent at the same time. They both felt that these words were a bit idiotic. The father had just met the mother. Of course, the son hadn't been born yet. A moment later, Fan Xian said with a glimmer of confusion, "So it was in Danzhou. Didn't Director Chen and Minister Fan tell you?"
The emperor said with a not quite there smile.
"I thought you would know something about what happened back then."
Fan Xian knew that if he opened his mouth and asked, the emperor in front of him, who was already immersed in beautiful memories, would certainly satisfy his curiosity.
For some reason, Fan Xian didn't want to ask. It was like what kind of beautiful scenery was hidden behind that layer of gauze, and in the mountains. There were monsters, big monsters. He only smiled calmly and said, "The elders didn't have the time to talk to me about these things. However, when I was young, I knew that the court had a special edict for Danzhou. In the beginning, it was to exempt taxes for 3 years. This time when I returned, I found that it has always been exempt. The people of Danzhou live well and are endlessly grateful to your Majesty. I am the ruler of the world. It is right for me to love my people. What need is there for gratitude?" The emperor smiled and looked at Fan Xian. He sighed and said, "Exempting Danzhou from taxes for 20 years is, first, because of my mother. Second, it is to thank the harbor back then." Fan Xian found it difficult to respond to these words. Did he have to accompany the emperor in talking about his first love? Furthermore, that first love was his own mother. Coincidentally, his stomach growled.
His eyes turned and he said, "Your Majesty,
I am truly hungry. Grant me a bowl of bird's nest." The emperor immediately laughed loudly. Pointing at Fan Xian's nose, he couldn't say anything for a moment. Ever since the Qing emperor had ascended to the throne, he had established himself in a region. His eyes looked down on the world. There was no one in the court who did not feel fear and respect for life. For over a dozen years, no official had dared to complain about being hungry and begging for food when the ruler and official were talking.
Even when the crown prince and great prince were young and carried by the ladies in the palace, they did not dare to speak so rudely.
After a long time, the emperor finally stopped laughing. His eyes were full of tender love. He scolded, "This shamelessness is nothing like your mother, ahem."
The emperor forcefully swallowed his words. Out of the corner of his eyes, he glanced at the half-bowl of bird's nest on the table.
Casually pointing, he said, "It's still warm. Eat it quickly." Fan Xian was startled. He eagerly stepped forward to receive the sparkling white porcelain bowl. Without any reservations, he finished eating in a few mouthfuls. His face did not purposely reveal tears of gratitude or an expression of His Majesty's boundless grace, but he still ate very smoothly. This scene fell into the emperor's eyes. The emperor was very satisfied. He thought to himself that Ji was indeed not a fake person. However, the emperor did not know that Fan Xian was cursing in his heart. He was not cursing the emperor for being petty. Rather, he hated that the bird's nest porridge had been eaten by Ji. Eunuch Yao, who was standing quietly to the side, was shocked when he saw this scene. He had been in the palace for many years, but he had not seen such a harmonious situation between ruler and official many times. The last time seemed to have been when Xu the scholar had returned from northern Qi. In order to show his favor and not take it to heart, the emperor had granted him half a piece of dried meat. Last time, Xu the scholar had been moved beyond words because of that piece of dried meat. He had knelt in front of the emperor in tears and repeatedly praised the emperor. He had not been as free and natural as Sir Fan Jr. was now. The emperor seemed to like Sir Fan Jr.'s way of doing things more. Eunuch Yao lowered his head, but he was sighing in admiration in his heart. This kind of ruler and official, this kind of father and son, was rarely seen in the palace. Just as he was thinking this, he was roused by the emperor's words. He quickly took the bowl of porridge and retreated. He walked along the eaves of the palace,
But he still thought of the scene earlier with deep fear and admiration.
There was only the emperor and Fan Xian left in the royal study.
A moment later, the emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said, "You are now a person of status.
You can't mess around like you did in the Imperial College. Donzhou, to kick the son of an official's family until he can't get out of bed for half a year for the sake of a family servant girl is a loss of face." Hearing these words, Fan Xian straightened his neck. In a calm but stubborn tone he said, "The emperor is right. However, if there is a next time, I will still kick him." "Fine, fine."
The emperor smiled.
"If you want to kick him, kick him. However, there has to be a limit to messing around. Don't go too far." Fan Xian sensed that there was another meaning in the emperor's words, so he didn't reply. He only nodded his head. The emperor looked at this young man's brows and furrowed his brows. He thought that this kid had made such a ruckus for the sake of a servant girl who had been chased out of the family. A dozen of his subordinates had been killed by crossbow bolts in the valley. Given this kid's vengeful nature, it would probably be difficult for him to forcefully swallow this anger. Of course, the emperor could directly ask Fan Xian to calm down, but the emperor did not want to do so. "I hear you're treating tonight?" Fan Xian started slightly and then respectfully said, "Yes, I've been away from the capital for over a year. There are a number of people I haven't seen. Let's use this opportunity to get together." The emperor's expression calmed. "It's still the same as before. Messing around can be done, but there is a limit."
"Yes, Your Majesty."
"The court will investigate the matter in the valley and give you an explanation."
"Yes, Your Majesty."
"Young man, you have to look at things further. Don't just limit yourself to what is in front of you."
"Yes, Your Majesty."
"Find some time in the next year. I want to go to Jiangnan and see how you and Xueqi have taken care of my granaries and palace treasury."
"Yes,
Fan Xian abruptly raised his head and looked at the emperor with a glimmer of surprise. The emperor was going on an inspection tour? This was something that had never happened in a dozen years, particularly with the various powers in Jingdou stirring. Although the emperor was in the palace and no one dared to be too arrogant, the matter in the valley in Jiaozhou all showed that the volcano under the dragon chair had become active. At this time, the emperor dared to go on an inspection tour? Fan Xian didn't understand what the emperor was thinking. After a moment of silence, he said, "I think." Changing his title to an official meant that he wanted to formally admonish and dissuade the emperor. However, the emperor did not give him the opportunity. Waving his hand, he said, "I have already made up my mind. The world is in my hands. There is no need to care about a few bugs jumping around. I am going to Donzhou to take a look. After the new year, you can return to Jiangnan. Remember to prepare well. However, the matter needs to be done secretly." Fan Xian had nothing to say and could only nod his head in agreement. The emperor looked at him and furrowed his brows. "You remember everything I said earlier?" Fan Xian guessed with a bit of a headache. "Are you referring to the messing around?" The emperor nodded his head with relief. "I only have these few sons. If you want to mess around, do as you please. Just don't make it beyond control. I also understand a bit about your thoughts." "Very good. Continue doing this." Fan Xian's heart jumped.
"Son Yu," this could already be considered a clear indication. But he felt that the emperor's gaze seemed to have penetrated his body and seen through his thoughts.
The emperor knew what he was thinking?
He immediately thought of the conflict he had with the second prince in front of Baoyue brothel the year before last and the conversation he had with the second prince in the tea shop. If the emperor was relying on that conversation to guess Fan Xian's thoughts, it had to be said that his guess was basically correct.
"That Haitang lady has returned to northern Qi, right?"
the emperor suddenly said.
Fan Xian's heart jumped again, but a glimmer of helplessness appeared on his face. Nodding his head, he said, "Lang Tiao brought people to bring her back." The emperor closed his eyes slightly and said, "At first, I didn't like it. After all, it hasn't even been 2 days since Chen promised herself to you. However, later on, I felt that this matter was not necessarily without any benefits. Tianyi Dao has deep connections with the various worship temples.
If you have the ability to control Tianyi Dao in your hands, for the court, it is a great service comparable to military merit."
Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, the emperor continued lightly, "After Ku He's death, it should be Haitang who succeeds. You have to think clearly about the connection." Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent.
The emperor said, "There is no harm in being closer to the women of northern Qi, but it is best to maintain some distance from northern Qi."
I don't doubt you. However, the Qing court's ambitions offer the world. Your various actions this year will always make some people in the military suspicious. They are all straightforward men on horseback. What they want is to open up new territory.
When you returned to the capital this time, presumably, you also felt that the attitude of the Bureau of Military Affairs toward you was not very good.
This is one of the reasons. Fan Xian remained silent. He knew that this was the so-called conflict between the Dove faction and the Hawk faction. However, the emperor was certainly a carnivore in his bones. Although he didn't doubt him, these words were actually a serious reminder to him.
"Yes, your majesty," Fan Xian replied warmly. "I know what I'm doing." Looking at his careful appearance, the emperor smiled comfortingly and waved his hand.
It's rare that you're back in the capital. Take a walk around the palace.
He was silent for a moment and then said, "Make the Empress Dowager happy."
Fan Xian accepted the edict and left the royal study. Eunuch Yao was waiting outside the door. Seeing him come out, he led him around the palace.
Although Fan Xian had entered the palace many times and was familiar with the paths inside, he knew that it was against the rules for a foreign official like him to enter the palace to see the emperor and greet the ladies of each palace. He had to be particularly careful, so he needed a eunuch to lead the way. When all was said and done, it was his status as a non-official member of the royal family and the princess son-in-law that gave him the opportunity to walk freely in the royal palace's gardens. The first place he went was Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager's ancestors' palace. The Empress Dowager had just woken up from her afternoon nap. Her body was a little tired, so she didn't say much to Fan Xian. However, Fan Xian sensitively sensed that although the Empress Dowager's attitude toward him was still cold, it was much better than when they were eating mutton giblet soup. After chatting for a bit, Fan Xian saw that the old woman's expression was a little uncomfortable, so he tactfully took his leave. Before he left, he said that he would wait for Wanner to return before going into the palace to greet her. As expected, the old woman was happy. Before leaving the palace, Fan Xian said a few words to the female official in a quiet voice and wrote out a prescription for the old woman's body. Although the female official in Hongguang Palace didn't dare give the Empress Dowager medicine indiscriminately, she knew of the medical reputation of this popular figure in court. She happily accepted the prescription and waited for the Imperial Academy of Medicine to examine it before using it. She couldn't resist praising the prince consort for his filial piety. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He left Hongguang Palace and followed the wide royal palace paths west. When he passed Guangxin Palace, he couldn't resist taking a few more glances. To the side, Eunuch Yao carefully asked, "Sir Fan, it's Guangxin Palace." Fan Xian was startled and jokingly scolded, "Of course I know. What are you thinking, you old man?" Eunuch Yao chuckled. "No matter what, she is your mother-in-law. If we don't go see her and it gets to the Empress Dowager's ears, I'm afraid she won't be happy." Fan Xian was startled. He stopped not far from Guangxin Palace. To be continued, if you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 459. Fan Xian stared at Guangxin Palace in a daze. He looked at the pillar at the foot of the palace and wondered if the hole in the pillar had been filled with lime or not. The first time he had spied into the royal palace at night, he had been stabbed by that serving girl through the pillar. The tip of the sword pierced through the thick wooden pillar and almost pierced his waist. To this day, Fan Xian seemed to still be able to feel the murderous intent on the sword, even though the serving girl had been killed on the spot. It was also that night that he had overheard the eldest princess colluding with the northern Qi royal family, the truth of Yan Bingyun being betrayed, and blocked Yan Xiaoyi's arrow that seemed to have come from the horizon. The snow had stopped, but a cold wind blew through the royal palace. It was even colder than a few days ago. Fan Xian shivered and shook his head self-mockingly. He left with Eunuch Yao and headed toward the eastern palace where the empress and crown prince were. Although the eldest princess was his mother-in-law and would eventually have to see her, it was best to maintain some distance from that seductive, cold and emotionless woman. Every day he could delay seeing her was a day. These years, under the emperor's secret arrangements and the cooperation of Chen Pingping and various other parties, Fan Xian had gradually accepted all of the eldest princess's power. The two sides had long been unable to coexist. There would eventually come a day when they would fight. However, the princess's power was not as it had been in the past, but Fan Xian was still wary. It was not only because she was Wan'er's mother, but also because of the strange feeling in his heart. In his previous life, he had heard a song by Lady He about giving him something and something. Fan Xian also felt this way. The eldest princess had given him the palace treasury, her daughter, her lover, and the Cui family. The Ming family was also about to be given to him. It looked like there were still many things she wanted to pass on to him. If he was the eldest princess, he would probably also bite his lip and not speak. His eyes would spit fire and burn this bad son-in-law to death.
Thank you to a certain book friend. I forgot your ID. Sorry.
There was also the Juanshang conference and the restless people in the military. Although the eldest princess was not a dinosaur that could spit fire, on the contrary, she was rather alluring. Fan Xian was still a bit afraid of the madness and charm of her gentleness. It felt very awkward to stay with such a 30-something mother-in-law who was known as the most beautiful woman in the world. Thus, from beginning to end, Fan Xian had only seen his greatest enemy once. This matter in itself was very interesting. Eunuch Yao glanced at the silent Fan Xian and didn't say anything. He followed with small, quick steps. Not long after, they arrived at the Eastern Palace. Coincidentally, the Empress was in Guangxin Palace chatting with the eldest princess. Only the Crown Prince was reading under the guidance of the Grand Tutor. Seeing Fan Xian enter the palace, the Crown Prince welcomed him with a smile and said, "How are your injuries? Originally, I wanted to go to your residence to see you, but thinking that I might disturb your rest, I gave up on this idea." Fan Xian bowed in greeting, then straightened up and smiled. "My body has always been strong. I will be fine after resting for a few days. Today, I received an edict to enter the palace, so I came to see you, Crown Prince, so that you would not worry."
When is little sister Chen coming back?
"Tomorrow." The Crown Prince smiled and said, "Since she's not here, you should seize the opportunity to play." The two of them smiled and sat down. They talked about the scenery and beauties of Jiangnan, but they didn't talk about anything unpleasant. Going back a few years, the Crown Prince had treated Fan Xian very well. Although he had listened to Xian Qiwu's suggestion and expressed goodwill toward Fan Xian with the intention of drawing him to his side, when Fan Xian had just entered the capital, the two of them had gotten along quite well. However, no one had thought that later matters would develop in such a strange manner. Fan Xian was actually also a prince. Furthermore, there was a problem left over from history that had not been resolved. Thus, naturally, Fan Xian picked it out and the Crown Prince became the person on the other side. Both sides knew that because of the problem left over from history, it was impossible for them to work together again. Inevitably, they both sighed in their hearts. However, during these 2 years, Fan Xian had primarily been on the second prince's side and had not carried out an all-out attack on the Crown Prince's faction. Thus, on the surface, the two of them could still maintain their current joyful and harmonious feeling. Even if the two of them had already shed all pretense of cordiality, in the palace, they still had to be joyful and harmonious.
Eunuch Yao watched this scene coldly from the side.
In his heart, he admired the shrewdness of the members of the royal family. After a warm conversation ended, Fan Xian rose to bid farewell. Moving closer to the Crown Prince's ear, he said in a quiet voice, "Your Highness, come back tonight." The Crown Prince smiled and said, "Speaking of which, I've actually never been to that brothel of yours." This genuine Crown Prince, who had been gradually marginalized by the day, sighed and said, "As you know, these years, I have been cultivating my character and rarely go outside the palace to play.
Let's talk about this famous Baoyue brothel.
First it was the second brother, then it was you.
They all had their ways.
I don't have any." Fan Xian wasn't sure if there was any hidden meaning in these words, but he was too lazy to guess. He chuckled, bowed respectfully, and left the Eastern Palace. Outside the palace, he was not surprised to see a familiar person. The eunuch with a face full of acne was the current head of the eunuchs in the Eastern Palace, Hong Zhu.
Hong Zhu quickly moved to the side to greet him. Fan Xian's expression was cold. He made a sound of acknowledgement and walked forward. However, there was a strange feeling in his heart. Looking at Hong Zhu's expression, it seemed that he had something to say to him. There was some fear between this little eunuch's brows, but he didn't know what he was afraid of.
However, in the palace, Fan Xian would not pay attention to Hong Zhu. He still had to pretend to look down on him. This chess piece buried in the palace could not be used carelessly. Following this, he went to Lady Xu and Lady Ning's palaces to bring a book list for the second prince's birth mother, Lady Xu. They were all ancient books from the Jiangnan Tianyi Pavilion. Lady Xu was clearly surprised. She hadn't thought that Fan Xian, who was fighting to the death with her son, would still carefully wait on her. She was slightly moved. In Lady Ning's palace, Fan Xian was given a good scolding. This was the first time this outspoken woman, who was born in Dongyi, saw Fan Xian after learning of his past. Looking at Fan Xian's brows and expression, Lady Ning couldn't help but think of the young lady of the Yi family who had saved her and the child in her womb. She was angry that Fan Xian didn't take his life seriously and scolded him until he nodded repeatedly. After talking about some stories from the past, Lady Ning's gaze softened and warmed. She looked at Fan Xian like she was looking at her own son and gently rubbed his head. She told him to bring Princess Chen into the palace often to see her when he had free time. Fan Xian agreed to each of them. As he left the palace, he occasionally turned his head and found that Lady Ning seemed to be wiping away the moisture at the corners of her eyes. His heart couldn't help but become wet. He felt an indescribable sorrow. These were all people from the past and things from the past. Busying and walking, Fan Xian also began to feel annoyed. It was like entering the palace for the first time to greet the ladies before the wedding. Walking through each palace, the things they said, and the things they did were all about the same. The continuous repetition was truly exhausting on both of their minds. Fortunately, Shufang Palace, which he came to last, could be more relaxed. After chasing away eunuch Yao, Fan Xian leaned against the chair like a tired dog. Narrowing his eyes, he sized up the serving girl busily serving him tea. The serving girl's brows were clear and gentle. Her head was lowered the entire time. She was very well behaved. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. As he accepted the tea, he pinched her white wrist. The serving girl glared at Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "Xing the first time I saw you, you were only 13. Now that you've grown up, your temper has also grown." Reclining on the couch, Yigui Pin watched Fan Xian and the child mess around. She couldn't resist opening her mouth and saying, "Go mess around outside. Don't come and mess with the people in my palace." Xing was the girl who had led Fan Xian around the palace to greet the ladies. Hearing the words of her two mistresses, her face immediately reddened and she ran to the back with small steps. Fan Xian took a sip of tea to moisten his throat. Seriously, he said, "Aunt, I'm about to leave the palace, so I won't talk much with you." Leave the palace? Yigui Pin was slightly startled and immediately understood what was going on. A glimmer of worry rose between her brows. "What exactly do you want to do tonight?" Fan Xian was also startled and asked, "You know about this?" Yigui Pin covered her mouth and smiled. "Sir Fan Jr. is holding a banquet tonight and inviting those important figures. This matter has long spread. It is the most sensational news in the capital. Although I live in the palace, how could I not know?" Fan Xian forced a smile and said, "It's only been one day, how could there be such a big ruckus? It's just that I haven't been back to the capital for over a year, so it's hard not to invite him." Yigui Pin said seriously, "Although there are some things I want to say to you and at least thank you on behalf of the child for this year of discipline, I know your business at night is more important. You should go first." She paused and then said, "Have you invited Hongqing?" Fan Xian shook his head and smiled slightly. "I'll take Wan to King Jing's manor some other day." Yigui Pin nodded. Fan Xian smiled again and said, "I can't leave yet. I've come specifically to pick up the third prince. At this time, Master Lu is still teaching him. How can I leave?" Yigui Pin paused and said worriedly, "Pinger is also going?" "Brothers, get together. With me here, what are you worried about?" Fan Xian smiled warmly with unspeakable confidence. It was close to the end of the year, and the heavy snow suddenly stopped. No one knew when it would start again. Jingdo was cold, but red lanterns hung high in the buildings by the street. Red candles burned brightly, and warm light scattered everywhere. It was as if the valuable bamboo charcoal was free. 3 layers of thick leather curtains hung on the main door of Baoyue brothel. Occasionally, a servant would pass by and lift the curtains. Hot air would rush out from inside the building.
For a moment, the air on this street seemed a bit warmer than other places. There were no pedestrians passing by on the street. The Jingdo government bailiffs and soldiers of the Jingdo garrison stationed there rubbed their frozen hands and looked at the shining building. They didn't say anything, but they were cursing in their hearts. They had to stand guard outside while the nobles in the building could bathe in the spring wind. Of all the restaurants and brothels in the world, probably only Baoyue brothel could be so extravagant. In the past it would not have been like this. However, today was different. Baoyue brothel did not open for business today. Half of the street had been sealed off by the people of the Jingdo government and the Jingdo garrison. This was an order that Baoyue brothel had reported to the government ahead of time. Without any delay, it had been specially approved. The people of the Jingdo government did not have the right to attend this gathering, but he still had to put in effort to set up all the defenses. It was not only him. The other officials in Jingdo also thought the same. Regardless of which faction they belonged to, they all had to serve Baoyue brothel today. Everyone who could be called a master in Jingdo was coming to Baoyue brothel. The Imperial College's Taichung Temple's vice minister, head of the Palace Treasury Transport Department, Overwatch Council's commissioner, inspector of Jiangnan, Sir Fan Jr. was treating today. The dazzling, powerful, and official position that was almost longer than the family tree was treating. Who dared not come? Who dared not come? Although everyone knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a lone official who dared to offend court officials and was willing to offend court officials, the guests today were the Crown Prince, 3 princes, 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs, and a few powerful figures. If even these people had to give Fan Xian face, then there was no need to mention others. Today, Baoyue brothel was crowded with officials. If anyone had the ability to kill all the guests tonight, the Qing kingdom would probably fall into chaos. The Jingdo government and the Jingdo garrison would not be able to control their vigilance. Looking at the tightness of the defense, it was comparable to the layers upon layers of deep palaces. A few high-class sedans arrived in front of Baoyue brothel under the cover of dusk. A few more important figures arrived in carriages. Behind them, a few powerful figures in the military rode in. No one brought too many personal attendants to obstruct Fan Xian's eyes. The few sons and grandsons only brought 2 or 3 tiger guards. These officials were worried about their own safety. Although the attack in the valley had happened recently, everyone knew that Baoyue brothel was the Fan family's property. The great prince arrived. The left and right deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs arrived. Xian Qiwu arrived. Ren Xiaoan arrived. Baoyue brothel was in full operation today. The girls helped these important figures to a side room to rest while they waited for the banquet to begin. Fan Xian chatted idly with them for a bit and told some naughty jokes.
He then led the child beside him to the door because he had heard the news of the Crown Prince's arrival. Seeing the child obediently allow Fan Xian to lead him, the hearts of the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs and the other officials at the banquet shook. The scene in front of them was enough to make these important figures think of many things. In ancient times, there were those who held the emperor hostage to order the marquises. Now, there was Sir Fan Jr. holding the child's hand. Who knew if the future Qing kingdom and the future world would be these 2 people? Fan Xian was holding the 3rd prince's hand. The 3rd prince shivered and turned his head to gaze at his teacher, who was 2 heads taller than him. A glimmer of worship flashed through his eyes. Shortly after, he asked for guidance. "Sir, your injury has not healed yet. Why did you come out to welcome us?" Fan Xian shook his head and gently explained, "The person who has come is the Crown Prince, the heir to the country. His identity is different. Furthermore, he is your elder brother. Regardless of whether you are an official or a brother, you should show some respect." A small sedan arrived in front of Baoyue brothel under the protection of a dozen guards. Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He saw a few tiger guards with long knives on their backs waiting coldly. Baoyue brothel was holding a banquet today. In order to prevent the people's discussions from flourishing and making the court feel awkward, all of the guests had removed their usual ceremonial guards. Even the Crown Prince, who had just arrived, could be considered to have a light carriage. Fortunately, this was the case. Otherwise, this street would probably be blocked to death by the pomp of these important figures. The curtain of the sedan lifted. The Crown Prince, dressed in light yellow clothing, came down from the sedan with a face full of smiles. Raising his eyes, he saw Fan Xian and the 3rd prince welcoming him outside the building. The Crown Prince was in a good mood. Although this was due, given Fan Xian's present power, this kind of respect was exactly what the Crown Prince needed.
Fan Xian and the third prince rushed to bow.
The Crown Prince hurriedly helped him up. In a moment, everyone in the building knew the Crown Prince had arrived and quickly came out to welcome him. Only the Great Prince seemed to have been so happy from drinking that he forgot to come out. The Crown Prince knew that his brother came from the ranks and had always been like this, so he didn't pay it much attention. A group of people surrounded the front of the building and were just about to go in to chat when another carriage slowly came over. The Crown Prince turned his head curiously and wondered who was putting on more airs than him to arrive later than him. Everyone also looked over and saw a thin, middle-aged official come down from the carriage. This official was not wearing clothing that indicated his rank, but everyone immediately recognized him. They couldn't help feeling surprised and shocked that this official would also come. The person who had come was none other than the governor of Jiangnan Road, Xueqi. Of the 7 roads under heaven, Xueqi controlled one. As a super-level official, he also controlled the wealthiest road in the world. Most importantly, he was the emperor's trusted aide and had once been the teacher of various princes in the library. Compared to the officials in court, his status was even more respected.
Xueqi looked at everyone and smiled slightly.
He first bowed to the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince repeatedly said he didn't dare. With him in the lead, everyone hurriedly bowed to Xueqi. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Sir Xue has returned to the capital to report on his work.
I was rude.
Thinking of how we have worked together in Jiangnan this year, I have received your favor, so I took the liberty to invite you over." Everyone made an "oh" sound and laughed that Sir Fan Jr.'s face was so big that he had even invited Governor Xue over. In their hearts, they wondered if it was because of the attack in the valley that Fan Xian wanted to demonstrate his might to some power that he had even brought Xueqi over.
These major figures couldn't be blamed for thinking this.
The banquet in Baoyue brothel could be considered a gathering of the younger generation. Old people like Director Chen and Xu the scholar would not dare to disturb them. Even if they wanted to invite them, the emperor would probably not allow it. Furthermore, everyone was thinking why Fan Xian had invited so many people from different powers to gather in Baoyue brothel.
It's just to eat, drink, and chat.
Everyone has been busy with official business this year. It's nearing the end of the year, so you have to take a break. Fan Xian stood in front of Baoyue brothel's door and smiled as he explained. He then saw a group of people walk over. At the front was the second prince, the one who looked very similar to Fan Xian. His temperament and aura seemed to be carved from the same mold. Yet, he had fought with Fan Xian in Jingdo, the north, and Jiangnan until blood flowed like rivers. Of course, the temporary victor was Fan Xian. Fan Xian and the second prince met each other's eyes. With great tacit understanding, regardless of who was first or who was first, regardless of status, they raised their hands at the same time, slightly bent their waists and bowed. Then the corners of their mouths twitched slightly. At the same time, a slightly bashful smile rose to their faces. The two of them sighed in their hearts. This smile had been missing for a long time. It's not about getting votes. Of course, those who have votes still have to vote for me. I've been a little busy lately, and I've had some minor emotional issues. I'll definitely report to everyone after the dust settles in a few days. My condition might be a little worse in the next few days, so I'll report to everyone in advance. Please understand. Today's chapter can only be said to be about the same as usual, but the last 3 sentences were very beautiful. Let me be narcissistic. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters.
Chapter 460.
On the east side of the 3rd floor of Baoyue brothel was a large flower hall. Half of the building was empty, and one could just see the hall on the 1st floor below. The wide Hu people's blanket suffused a fishy red color downstairs and had a different flavor. There were honored guests in the building, so this half of the flower hall had been emptied. When he entered the flower hall, the second prince's eyes unconsciously glanced toward the door and saw 2 words written in gold paint.
He couldn't help but be curious as to what they meant.
Hong Men. As the host, Fan Xian smiled calmly as he welcomed everyone into the hall. The flower hall was separated by screens and hanging velvet curtains.
Steam rose.
As soon as the important figures entered the flower hall, They had their cloaks taken off by the girls beside them, leaving them wearing only unlined clothing.
It was enough. There were all kinds of exquisite tea and pastries placed on the table. The plates used were also good things from Jiangnan. The wine was held in the highest quality glass cups. The wine was the most expensive liquor in the world, Wuliangya. The girls serving beside him were all outstanding beauties, gentle and silent. Naturally, the crown prince sat in the most honored position. He gazed at Fan Xian and laughingly scolded, "Only you can enjoy such good things. Look at the things here. They all come from the 3 large workshops. The palace still hopes to exchange them for silver. Who would dare to spend as freely as you do?" The Qing people were simple and honest. Even the royal officials were a bit more cautious. They were not at all as extravagant as the northern Qi court. The banquet Fan Xian had set up today was indeed a bit out of bounds. Everyone knew that the palace treasury was under Fan Xian's control. It would not be a problem for him to transfer some expenses. However, they didn't know if the crown prince was secretly stabbing them in the back when he said this with a chuckle. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He smiled and said, "If I can enjoy it, I should make the most of it." Naturally, Xueqi sat at the first table to the left. He had come by imperial edict to watch the show, so he did not mind much. Additionally, he had been in Jiangnan for a long time and seemed to be used to this kind of enjoyment.
Seeing the admiration of these major figures in the capital, he couldn't help the corners of his mouth twitching slightly and smiling.
He thought to himself that it was not easy to live in Jingdo. Unfortunately, the enjoyment was far inferior to that of Jiangnan. The banquet began. The girls were quiet and speechless. They began to place food and pour wine for the guests at each table. Although they had undergone special training these 2 days, when they abruptly opened their eyes and saw so many important figures in the Qing court, the girls still couldn't help but feel nervous. Their rosy lips pressed tightly together. The princes and officials in this hall had all rolled around in the brothels before, but to suddenly have so many people gathered in one hall, it was really a bit confusing. In fact, there weren't many guests, only about a dozen or so. Each of them had a girl sitting beside them, and behind them sat a close attendant. Even so, the reception hall was somewhat full. The person serving Fan Xian was none other than the shopkeeper of Baoyue brothel, Sang Wen. For an occasion like this, it was inappropriate to start drinking and talking at the beginning.
Drinking orders were repeated, breasts and buttocks were touched, particularly with Xueqi and the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs present.
The young noblemen were still a bit proud of their status. For a moment, the hall was quiet and heavy. They only talked about some idle jokes in court, such as Scholar Xu collapsing drunk on the snowy street again yesterday. In any case, Xu Wu's personality was relaxed and didn't mind how the younger generation made fun of him. No one dared to use these princes and Fan Xian as a joke, particularly Fan Xian. Everyone was still guessing what the true purpose of this meal was. Amidst the awkwardness, Xueqi minded his own business and drank his wine. He grabbed the girl's small hand beside him and played with it. This man immediately shed the air of an official and gained the feeling of a middle-aged prodigal son. It looked like the scholars of the Library of Books had fought many battles with the skeletons of the Red Chamber. The second prince took a shallow sip and looked at Fan Xian across from him. He smiled slightly and said, "Anji, I haven't come to Baoyue brothel in a year. I find that the girls here are much prettier than before." The atmosphere immediately relaxed. Between Fan Xian and the second prince, there had to be someone who would speak first. "Nonsense," Fan Xian laughingly scolded. "Given the lineup today, it is impossible for this Baoyue brothel to serve you well. I won't hide it from everyone. The 13 girls in this brothel are not just from my brothel. As long as it is the most famous girl in the capital, I have invited them all. Regardless of whether it is the pleasure boats on Lujing River or the musical house, if you can find another popular girl after you leave this brothel tonight, then I will lose." Everyone was startled and thought that this was quite a big move. It was not a matter of spending money. Rather, in one short day, he had made all of the brothel in Jingdo obediently offer up their most famous girls. Fan Xian's power had indeed reached a hair-raising level. Everyone turned their heads to look and saw the girls beside them had their heads lowered shyly. After a closer look, everyone couldn't help but laugh. They recognized that one was someone on Lujing River and the other was a girl from the musical house. They were all old acquaintances. Only the second prince's gaze dimmed a little. Speaking of which, it was absurd.
Of the dozen or so girls in the brothel, 4 belonged to the Lujing River affairs that Li Hongqing had previously been responsible for.
However, Yuan Meng had died in Jiangnan, Xueqi had defected to Fan Xian, and Li Hongqing had been grounded by King Jing. He raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian from a distance. He saw that Fan Xian's expression was calm.
However, there was a not quite there smile in his eyes.
For a moment, he wasn't sure if Fan Xian wanted to use this small matter to demonstrate his might or if he had other thoughts. The second prince smiled slightly and said, Baoyue Brothel's management is successful. Presumably, it is all because of Miss Sang's clever and discerning eyes. I offer you a toast. After saying this, he raised the wine cup in his hand and offered a toast to Sang Wen by Fan Xian's side. For him to address himself as a prince, it was in line with his usual gentleness. Moreover, in a romantic setting, it would be meaningless to just talk about seniority. The crowd did not mind, but they were curious. Why was the first toast to Sang Wen? Where did this put the host of the day, Fan Xian? At this moment, Sang Wen was leaning against Fan Xian's side. She picked up a strand of moss and brought it to his lips. Suddenly hearing these words, she couldn't help but start and turn her head to glance at Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled slightly and nodded. Sang Wen stood and bowed slightly toward the second prince. She drained the cup and did not wait for the second prince to say anything. She poured herself another cup and invited the crown prince and great prince, who were sitting at the head of the table. The crown prince was a bit strange today. He only cared about teasing the beauty in his arms. The beauty was being coaxed by the heir to the throne of a country. Her entire body had long gone soft. The crown prince looked very pleased and completely ignored the turbulent undercurrents between the second prince and Fan Xian at the banquet. However, the great prince and Sang Wen drank a cup and sighed. The second prince's expression did not change. He smiled slightly and said, It is rare for so many friends to be present today. There must be something to liven things up. Ever since Miss Sang became the shopkeeper of Baoyue Brothel, the people of Jingdo no longer have the good fortune to hear such things. I wonder if we can ask Miss Sang Wen to sing a song? Sang Wen smiled slightly. Her gentle face was calm. She stood and was about to go get her zither when unexpectedly, her hand was pulled by Fan Xian. Fan Xian held Sang Wen's hand and looked calmly at the second prince.
Sang Wen doesn't sing anymore.
Sang Wen was startled and thought, why disturb the banquet over such a small matter? She had been a singer since she was young and had long gotten used to singing at banquets. For a moment, she had forgotten that Fan Xian was someone who was most unwilling to have his own people serve other people. The second prince furrowed his brows. A glimmer of confusion flashed across his handsome face. It was as if he had not thought Fan Xian would be so unyielding. After the banquet began, both sides had been testing each other's attitudes. He also wanted to know what Fan Xian was preparing to do after returning to the capital this time. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian's response was such a killjoy. Fan Xian glanced at the second prince. He thought to himself that he had created this scene today, but his goal was to kill the scene. Sitting below him, the official of Taichung Temple, Ran Xiao-en, pulled on his sleeve and reminded him to be careful. He only smiled. The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs narrowed his eyes slightly and said, Sir Fan Jr., what are you saying? Given the prince's status, what is wrong with having this girl present a song? Fan Xian's confrontation in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs had long created a crack between him and the military. Each day that the attack in the valley was not investigated, the two sides would not be at peace. The Qing Kingdom's military had always been simple, direct, and crude. This deputy was Chu Xiangdong. He had been the vanguard of the last northern expedition. He had a great deal of military service, so he was not afraid of Fan Xian's power. Hearing Fan Xian's cold words, he spoke to stab him. Fan Xian did not get angry. He only smiled and said, Lady Sang only sings in Chen Garden. If Deputy Chu wants to hear it, go outside the capital and ask Director Chen. There is no point in asking me. The words, Director Chen, were tossed out. The second prince smiled and didn't say anything more. The expression of the Deputy Chu of the Bureau of Military Affairs also changed. He forcefully swallowed the vicious words he was about to say back into his stomach. Drink! Amidst the awkwardness, the great prince, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly raised his cup and roared. He had come from the military and had a bold personality.
He had wanted to make up for Fan Xian's relationship with the military and, at the same time, make the gap between his brothers smaller. Seeing the strange situation at the banquet, a strange anger surged in his chest. The two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs also came from the military. Their boldness was not inferior to others. They furrowed their brows slightly and drained the 3 Liang wine cups in their hands in one gulp. Then, they flipped their wrists to demonstrate Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled slightly and placed the cup to his lips. He slowly tipped it. Although his speed was slow, he did not stop. Like a clear spring entering a lake, the cup was emptied. The crown prince in the first seat helplessly raised his cup to the great prince and said, "Big brother, I was drinking." Your loud voice almost scared the wine out of my cup.
Everyone laughed loudly.
The crown prince then smiled at the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs and said, "Don't think about bringing the military style to Baoyue brothel. I know there is some resentment between you and Nji, but this matter has not been thoroughly investigated. Why should there be resentment between officials? Even if there is resentment, don't compete in drinking." He pointed at Fan Xian and smiled at the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs.
Have you forgotten?
The year before last, Sir Fan Jr. drank 3,000 cups in one night and made that Marquis of Northern Qi drink like a dead pig. When it comes to alcohol tolerance, Nji is not afraid of you old men in the military. As a member of the Eastern Palace, Xian Qiwu knew what his master wanted to do. He quickly followed along and said, "Generals, I feel that there is no harm in competing in drinking with Sir Fan Jr.
After that night, Sir Fan Jr. has not composed poetry.
If we can make him write another 300 poems and have the Bangxian's High Poetry Anthology continue, the Bureau of Military Affairs will have done a great service to the world. I'm afraid even the Emperor will be incomparably happy."
After these words were said, everyone agreed. Even Xueqi became interested.
He invited Fan Xian to drink a few cups and then forced the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs to compete in drinking with Fan Xian. After a mouthful of wine, the atmosphere immediately became much livelier.
Fan Xian's boldness in drinking also made the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs feel much better.
The second prince suddenly smiled and said, "Speaking of Nji not composing poetry after that night, it is truly a great loss to the world. However, I heard that when Nji was in Northern Qi, he had written a small poem for that Northern Qi saint girl.
I wonder if this is true."
This was the most famous scandal in the world last year. The Northern Qi people were unhappy in their hearts, but the Qing Kingdom people were incomparably happy.
Hearing these words, the slightly tipsy figures all began to make a ruckus. They insisted on hearing Fan Xian talk about the specifics of the story. Fan Xian smiled and scolded them. Naturally, he wouldn't go into detail. He casually brushed them off.
Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at the crown prince and felt a bit surprised. This crown prince was indeed much more promising than he was 2 years ago. However, the real power in the crown prince's hands was gradually decreasing. He just watched him and the second prince fight like this. Did he want to reap the benefits? But where did his confidence come from? He wasn't his father. The banquet gradually came to an end. Everyone's spirits gradually rose. The great prince stood and grabbed those people, forcing them to drink. Fan Xian snickered as he watched this scene. He thought that this person had probably been too strictly disciplined by the great princess of Northern Qi in his manner.
Now that he finally had a chance to come out and be at ease, he wouldn't let this opportunity go.
Fan Xian then looked at the crown prince who seemed to be a bit drunk while the second prince still maintained a sober expression. He couldn't help but smile slightly and open his mouth to say, "I haven't returned to Jingdo in a year. I rather miss everyone in the capital." His expression suddenly changed. He sighed sadly and said, "It's a pity that before we entered the capital, we were ambushed by bandits. 12 people died under my command. These people were all officials of the Overwatch Council, talents of the court. They worked hard for the court in Jiangnan and finally had the chance to return to Jingdo to reunite with their families. Yet, they died tragically 12 li outside of Jingdo. Those women and children who were waiting for their return at home are probably still living in misery at home." He raised the strong wine in his cup and drained it in one gulp. In a low voice he said, "Thinking of this wine, I really can't drink anymore." The flower hall on the 3rd floor of Baoyue brothel suddenly quieted down. They knew that the highlight of the night had finally arrived. In a quiet little alley about 5 li away from Baoyue brothel, a group of black-clothed people suddenly appeared at the mouth and end of the alley, blocking the alley tightly. The leader, Mu Tai, looked at the 3 people in the alley with a heavy expression. Pointing at the leader, he said, "Are you called Yang Gongqing?" The leader's right hand slowly pressed against the bulge at his waist. Coldly, he said, "Yes, what advice do you have?" Mu Tai revealed his teeth in a smile. A strange expression flashed across his dark face. "I want to confirm your identity as one of the 8 generals in case you kill the wrong person." He then flashed his body and left. The 2 groups of black-clothed people at the mouth and end of the alley silently charged over. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 461. Not only did I cosplay Wu Zhenyu, but I also cosplayed The Godfather, the 60s and 70s, a series of great, beloved ones. P.S. Among the 8 generals, there is no Yang surname. I messed it up yesterday, so I made do with it. Thank you for reminding me. Yang Gongqing, one of the 8 generals. 8 generals. 8 generals. It seemed to be a simple description, but when these 3 words were put together, it had a completely different meaning. Everyone knew that this referred to the 8 aces the second prince secretly raised in his manor. These 8 aces always followed by the second prince's side, and were one of the second prince's most powerful martial powers. In the battle between Fan Xian and the second prince the year before last, it was these 8 generals who had kept Fan Xian in the tea shop outside Baoyue brothel. Although they did not manage to keep him, they still left a deep impression on Fan Xian. They were indeed 8 aces. Outside the Jingdo government, after the case closely related to Baoyue brothel and Fan Xija had been tried, Fan Xian had attacked and shattered Xie Bai An's spirit. Because of this, it had caused a problem with the Zhenqi in his body. This was the first reason. Beside Yushan Road, in the autumn rain, the killers of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council attacked and silenced him with metal rods. This startled Fan Wujiu and caused him to disregard the second prince's entreaties to stay and float away. This was the second reason. Ever since that small battle that had not been announced to the world, there were only 6 of the second prince's 8 generals left. The second prince was a guest in Baoyue brothel. He was confident that Fan Xian would not dare to do anything to him. In order to appear sincere, he did not bring a single person and sent the remaining 6 generals back. Yang Gongqing was one of them. On such a night when he raised his head and saw nothing but white snow and layers of clouds covered the silver moon, he was blocked by a group of black-clothed men and cut off his path of retreat. The day had been bright and clear. The snow on the eaves of the alley turned into water and dripped down. The alley was cold and damp. As night fell, the water droplets decreased and gradually condensed into icicles. However, there was still a drop of water that gathered at the tip of the icicle, drooping and ready to drip. Yang Gongqing's pupils constricted slightly. With a flip of his hand, he pulled out the sword at his waist. The tip of his foot pushed off the ground and his entire body had already shot up. The icicle broke in the middle with a cheese sound, turning into a sharp light that pierced towards the black-clothed man in front of him. Yang Gongqing then stepped on the shoulders of his 2 companions, pointing them towards the 2 black-clothed men who were attacking from both sides. His figure had already risen, and was about to reach the top of the alleyway. He knew that this was an ambush that had been premeditated for a long time. The other party had figured out his daily route, which was why they had trapped him in the alley. But he didn't want to die, so he would rather sacrifice his 2 companions, or rather, his disciples, and use them as sandbags to block the blade so that he would have time to escape. It was escape, not resistance. At this time, Yang Gongqing had long lost his drive. There were not many people who dared to ambush and kill people in the capital, and the only person who had a grudge against the second prince was that person. That person had sent people to kill him, and they were not people he could fight against. It had to be said, Yang Gongqing was worthy of being one of the second prince's 8 personal generals. His reaction speed and methods of dealing with the situation were the best of the best. When the black-clothed men below groaned and knocked his disciples to the ground, and at the same time split apart the icicles that carried his true power, he had already swept into the air. He only needed a moment to step onto the alleyway and escape into the night sky. Unfortunately, the assassin did not give him this moment.
A crossbow arrow flew over silently, piercing straight towards his chest. Yang Gongqing groaned. With a flick of his wrist, he chopped downwards. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, he chopped down the crossbow arrow. But, since the crossbow arrow had shot out, naturally, there was more than one. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Over 10 crossbow arrows shot out at the same time. He was in midair. How could he block them? Although he relied on his high cultivation to forcefully block a few crossbow arrows aimed at his vitals, he still let a few crossbow arrows that slipped through the net sink deep into his thigh. Yang Gongqing's thigh was in pain and numb. His eyes looked like they were going to pop out. He fell from midair in despair. He only had the time to jump out of the alleyway for a moment. In that moment, he saw 7 crossbowmen standing on the eaves of the houses in the alleyway. They were in different positions, but they blocked the top of the alleyway. There were assassins below and crossbowmen above. It was an inescapable net. How could he escape? While Yang Gongqing was falling, he wanted to shout for help. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that the black-clothed men in the alleyway had also taken out crossbow arrows. An incoming crossbow arrow shot into his mouth. Blood splattered, forcing him to stop shouting. At that moment he thought in despair. Why did the opponent bring so many crossbows to deal with a small fry like him? The crossbow arrows were too concentrated. While he was in midair, his body had already been hit by dozens of crossbow arrows. He looked like a laughable hedgehog. With a paw, Yang Gongqing's body fell into the snowy water, shaking up a puddle of blood. But his cultivation was really high. Even after suffering such a heavy injury, he still did not stop breathing. He knelt on one knee and used his sword to support himself. Looking at the leader of the black-clothed men who was getting closer and closer to him, his eyes revealed a trace of the frenzied savagery of a dying beast. Yes, he was an expert. But an expert who was ambushed by dozens of crossbows could not do anything. Unless he was Yi Luyun. Fresh blood flowed down the densely packed crossbow shafts, flowing out his essence, qi, spirit, blood, and soul. Yang Gongqing's throat gurgled, but he refused to collapse. The leader of the black-clothed men walked in front of him. With a backhand, he pulled out the straight blade at his waist. The blade was as bright as snow, without a speck of dust. The majority of the icicles on the eaves of the alley had already been chopped off, leaving only a few lonely icicles. The snowy water that had been accumulating for a long time finally converged into a large round bead of water. It dripped down, dripping into the bloody water in the alley with a light sound. The leader of the black-clothed men pulled out his blade and silently chopped down. With one strike, Yang Gongqing's head fell off cleanly. Yang Gongqing's headless body remained kneeling. The black-clothed leader waved his hand. The crossbowmen standing on top of the houses flipped over and fell to the ground. The assassins in the alley silently moved forward and took away all the crossbow arrows. Then, they erased all traces in the alley. The group of people took off their black clothes and disguised themselves as ordinary commoners. They left the alley and merged into the seemingly unchanging life of the capital. The alleyway was quiet, as if no one had ever been there. However, there were 3 more corpses. Without the support of the crossbow bolts, the headless corpses finally fell and smashed into the alleyway with a dull thud. In the past, I had never thought that something like crossbow arrows would be so terrifying. Fan Xian raised his wine cup and slowly drank. His eyes were full of confusion. You all know that the Overwatch Council is also used to using crossbows. But, I still did not think that when something used to kill reaches a certain level, it would become so terrifying. At the banquet in Baoyue Brothel, everyone listened quietly to Fan Xian's narration. This was the details of the attack in the valley. Everyone could hear the glimmer of melancholy and coldness in Fan Xian's words. Fan Xian placed his wine cup on the table and smiled slightly. A sky full of crossbow rain. I have never seen it in this life. Presumably, I also never saw it in my previous life. This was not an attack. It was more like on the battlefield. Only then did I realize that a single person's strength is indeed limited. The great prince slowly nodded his head across from him. A complicated expression appeared on his face. Perhaps he was thinking of the years of fighting with the Hu tribes during the Western expedition. The sound of the crossbow arrows hitting the carriage was like a soul-stealing drum. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It was as if he was recalling the specific circumstances at the time.
That feeling of being surrounded and killed was not good. The crown prince sighed and comforted him.
Fortunately, it is already over. And Ji, you are able to survive. Those rebels and traitors will be punished one day. The court is currently investigating. Presumably, there will be a result in a few days.
Thank you, Your Highness. Fan Xian raised his cup to everyone and smiled. Yes, at least I survived.
Presumably, many people will be disappointed. Even the city guarding crossbows were used, yet they were still unable to kill me. What does this mean?
No one replied to his words. The expressions of the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs were not good. Without question, the attack in the valley involved the military. Although the court's investigation had not yielded any results, this was already an ironclad fact. When Fan Xian spoke to this point, the military elders could not help but secretly speculate. I am a very confident person. Fan Xian indicated that he had already finished his cup. Fan Xian indicated that he had already finished his cup and smiled. Including the emperor and the director, the elders have all asked me why you are so confident.
Everyone listened attentively, but a feeling of absurdity grew in their hearts. At this moment, all the important figures of the Qing kingdom were present, as well as the crown prince and 3 princes. However, once Fan Xian opened his mouth, everyone's attention would be drawn to him.
This was not only because he was the host of the banquet. It was also because everyone seemed to unconsciously admit that he was the person with the most power.
This was truly absurd.
Perhaps in history, there had been powerful officials who overturned the court and were known as 9,000-years-old eunuchs. However, there had never been such a young and intimidating illegitimate child of the royal family, and a dazzling one at that. Everyone unconsciously glanced at the crown prince. The crown prince was smiling slightly as he listened to Fan Xian speak. There was not a trace of unease in his expression.
On the contrary, it was filled with comfort and understanding. The great prince coughed gently. Fan Xian's left hand gently played with a large wine goblet.
His gaze looked at the 1-foot table in front of him as if he was looking at a beautiful scene.
Why am I so confident? Because I believe that I am the luckiest person in the world. No one's luck can be better than mine. A person who had clearly died had mysteriously come back to life and had lived such a colorful and even bizarre life. This kind of luck needed to be slowly celebrated in the years to come. Fan Xian smiled and said, I said earlier that the Overwatch Council is also used to using crossbows. Those crossbows cannot kill me.
My enemies will certainly not be as lucky as me. In the Overwatch Council not far from the royal palace, in the secret room that Director Chen liked to stay in, Yan Bingyun was wearing a pure white cotton robe.
He stared at the files on the table in a daze. A moment later, he sighed and rubbed his temples.
He felt that the soreness there was difficult to stop.
There was a knock on the door. An official of the 2nd Bureau's intelligence department flashed in and handed him 3 small bamboo tubes sealed with wax. Yan Bingyun used his fingernail to pry open the wax seal. He took out the intelligence report inside and scanned it.
He then brought it closer to a candle to the side and burned it. Under the strange gaze of the intelligence official, he said tiredly, "Tonight's matter will not be recorded." The official of the intelligence department immediately lowered his head in acknowledgement and said, "Of the 43 targets, 3 have already been eliminated."
Yan Bingyun seemed to have a headache.
Hearing these words, he shook his head in annoyance and waved his hand to indicate that he understood and had him leave.
The secret room returned to silence. Yan Bingyun looked at the remaining pieces of wax on the table and became lost in thought again. Tonight, Fan Xian was holding a banquet in Baoyue Brothel while the Overwatch Council was in a second-level state. In the darkness of Jingdo, who knew how many people were moving and how many would die? All of this was because of Fan Xian's madness. Tonight's plan had been personally drawn up by Yan Bingyun. Although he had expressed his firm opposition to it in front of Fan Xian, he still had to continue doing what needed to be done. In this plan, he had to kill 11 people and capture 32. Of the 11 targets that had to be eliminated first, 6 of them were the second prince's 8 generals. This was a crazy act of revenge. 3 of the second prince's 8 generals had already died. Given the Overwatch Council's frenzied counterattack, the power of a mere manor could not shake the overall situation. Presumably, they would soon receive news of the other people's deaths. Yan Bingyun walked to the window and lifted a corner of the black cloth covering the window. Just like Chen Pingping had done in the past, He looked through the narrow space toward the royal palace not far away. The royal palace was still bright and exuded a holy and lofty aura through the black clothing. He gazed at the royal palace, full of worry, and thought, the emperor wants you to be a lonely official, not a heartless official. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.